It's Wednesday.
Yeah, it's Wednesday.
Hi, everybody.
Hi.
We're on the internet. It's Wednesday. This weekend is WonderCon.
We'll be there, right?
I'll be there. I'll be there on Saturday.
I'll be there Saturday.
I'm on a panel 2 before yours.
You're on the panel before mine.
2 before, but
before.
I'll be running there.
I'm not on any panels, but I'll be there.
I am also in that boat.
Yeah, no panel. No panel WonderCon.
Not important.
We're having a big party that night.
We are having a big party that night. There's a couple big parties
Yeah.
that night because it's Anaheim and that's the only thing to do. Other than I guess there's a park.
Hartree.
I
What
guess
do you
there's
mean? Yeah, I was gonna say.
Yeah, Medieval Times is out there.
Oh,
Right?
that's fair. Medieval times and pirate times. And
Ooh,
pirate
never been to
adventures.
Pirate Times. Gotta
Oh.
go.
I have
like-
not
I
been to
heard it's
Pirate
good.
Times.
It's
Oh,
like
man.
medieval times in a pool.
But wet.
Our
Pirates.
Damn.
friend Kate Lett
Forget
has
what a
like
medieval
the
times you
all-time
worry.
medieval
Yes.
times record. It's really amazing. I think, but before she moved to this country, she'd already been to medieval times like 17 times.
There's
that?
also one in Toronto,
Kate.
hilariously.
Toronto
But she
needs
only
one.
came to the one in Anaheim.
There's one in Toronto?
Yeah.
That's hilarious.
Well, now I want to go to Toronto.
For
No,
those
you
of you,
don't.
for those of you wondering, do we have a Canadian in the room? Is that what's happening?
That's
or-
right.
We have a Canadian.
You can
Yay.
tell because she's wearing Truth, Justice, and the American Way.
Yeah, it's
Also an immigrant, so
Yes.
I'm
Created by a
perfectly
Canadian.
on brand. Yes, that's true.
Kryptonians.
Co-created,
They get the
I guess,
job
by
done.
Inspired by.
We are being
Guy from
stared at by a
Montreal.
plethora of angry Lego pieces and stuffed animals, and about 5 cameras, which means we must be doing a comic book show.
And this absolutely gorgeous
It's
layout
really.
by Dan.
Take a moment. It's Dan Smith came in. We have a guest artist today who came in and did our DC cornucopia up here.
It's pretty
Question
amazing.
my right to acquire these doodles of cheese for the glory of apocalypse, dog!
Alan Scott, Green Lantern, going, I ain't afraid of no wood. I don't know why Alan. I cosplayed as Alan Scott a couple times.
Did you carry a tree branch and be wait?
There was-
Were you
there
the
was no
Hot
tree-
Earth 2 version of Alan Scott
was-
with a nice boyfriend?
No, I was not. That was before then. I was young, so this was like 1991. It was a while ago. There was no. I don't
Bless
think
you.
there was a. We got Bizarro. Who else do we have?
We have a guy in the corner.
Chemo.
Oh, Kino, there you go.
Yeah.
And I think there's a Tiny Atom. There's a Tiny Atom.
Yeah.
Looks like
Yeah,
it.
it's a Tiny Atom.
And he's so tiny you can't see his words.
No, he
Gus
has.
is about to
He
sit
looks
on
like he's
the
talking
video.
in Woodstock language from the Peanuts.
Oh yeah, you're right.
And Bizarro Superman.
Oh, there's
So,
Chemo.
Alan Scott's grousing about his failed movie dealings and saying I ain't afraid of no wood, and it's probably a joke about Hollywood. It's too clever.
Or Edwood.
Wow.
It could go
Or
that way.
Edward.
I don't know.
Wow.
And
I'm
Bizarro
good.
tells the same story wrong all night long.
long.
So me leave a bar. Love it. Love it, Dan. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well
Thank
done.
you for this fabulous multicolored and it's very much on point because today we're going to be talking about DC Comics.
Yay!
We're going to be talking about the big granddaddy of superhero comic books and why they're a big crazy mess of cool and sometimes suck and sometimes weird and sometimes awesome and how they've affected the lives. I mean, it's characters like Superman or Batman are international
Wonder Woman.
icons. Wonder Woman. Well, yes,
I have
thank
a
you.
gene in my head that anytime someone says Superman and Batman, I have to add and Wonder
Wonder
Woman.
Woman?
Like, I'm very
No,
sorry.
no,
and
I'm
I'll
there.
try to prevent
I'm
it
there.
in the future.
Don't. I'm sorry.
I own more classic Wonder Woman comics than I do Batman, so thank you for the
Individual comics, or you just have that one omnibus?
individual and the omnibus.
Correct.
Yes, would be the answer. She's fun. But we're going to be talking about why they're exciting again and why everything is getting interesting over there and why I'm back reading. I went away for a while, now I'm back.
Part of the fun of this is going to be that, like, for any companies with histories this long, but especially, like, DC sort of invented the, like, did all the first steps in, like, how do you deal with continuity this big? Here's our different solutions over time. Every few years, we're going to try something, and then we're going to roll it back and try something else, and then we're going to roll back this way and try this thing. So they've got a really interesting history that way, but that also means that sort of, like, people are DC fans for life, but everyone will sort of disagree on, like, this was the era I really loved.
Yeah,
This thing was not for me. And you'll find somebody else for whom it's backwards. And it gets really fascinating. So we have different sort of perspectives represented at the table. And you are the rebirth.
Well,
the returning.
It's very
diehard,
Doctor
yeah?
Who. It's very Doctor Who of you, kind of in a way.
Yeah.
Yes.
Which is a weird. I don't know if I stand by that analogy. I'm Taliesin
would
Jaffe,
say
by the way, at Executive Goth to my left.
I'm Ashley Victoria Robinson.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Yay! Guests.
I'm Amy Dallen.
Crossover.
And I'm Matt Key. Well, I said it
That
very.
was so polite.
Which is kind of his brand.
Polite
I
and
thought it
filled
was
with
Doctor
wonder.
Strange.
Doctor Strange also.
Yeah.
can be polite.
Dr. Strangelove.
Speaking of nice, Dan Radre says the Toronto Medieval Times is so fun.
Aw.
It is. It's a great trip. In your 4th grade year, we all go from all across Ontario to medieval times.
That's
usually in the winter.
We not to have a Critical Role crossover, but a bunch of us went to, and you were there. If we all did medieval times a while ago, and we all got the light up dragon necklaces and proudly wore them.
Well, that was also partially for a Burning Man meeting. Which, by the way, tickets are on sale right now. If you haven't already gotten into that waiting room, you're not gonna
SoCal thing that has been said yet today.
It's okay. Hamilton individual tickets go on sale on April 30th.
I already got mine.
Yeah. Season tickets?
Yeah, oh yeah, friend of.
Literally, Geek and Sundry just goes dark.
Yeah.
For 10 days.
Somebody, when we talked about this last week on the channel, someone was like, it's coming to LA, huh? I'm gonna miss Geek and Sundry. Well, that's fair.
By the way, if you're not watching the DC TV shows, there have been 5 Hamilton references across all the seasons so far, due in the last 2 episodes of Supergirl. So that's what you should watch.
I haven't watched the musical yet. I'm excited.
It's great.
I can't wait. I'm not caught up on Flash, so I couldn't watch the musical live, and it makes me really sad.
They have nothing to do with continuity.
So is this,
Okay, good.
is this how people are finding DC Comics now? Is through the TV shows?
Okay, I'm gonna take a moment to be retailer. Yes, it's amazing. Like, I've worked at the shop for quite a long while now. I haven't quite hit a decade, but we're getting there.
Woo!
And it's been so a lot of this, and a lot of me talking about DC is going to be sort of this process of watching people like discover and come to it and come away from it, and like it's been really interesting. But it's been absolutely fabulous. Like the Marvel movies and the DC like CW shows have been, in the period of time that I've worked there, the things that like make people come in to be like. The difference in the average knowledge of who the Flash is.
Yeah.
Like, I know it
and
sounds
they all
dumb
think
to
it's
say.
Barry Allen, which is adorable because we all know it's Wally West.
I know a whole generation kind of got left behind there.
It's like the people who grew up watching the Justice League cartoon are like, who is Hal Jordan?
Yeah.
Green Lantern is black, and you're like, correct.
Yeah.
Yes, he
It's like, you're right, and there's a bunch of stuff. So it's been absolutely fabulous. Like it's.
So what are I mean, like, I'm a little behind here. What are the DC shows? What are the DC
There's
shows?
Arrow.
Yep.
It goes Supergirl
Green
on
Arrow
Mondays.
is the basis of the DC universe, which
On
nobody
TV.
saw coming.
Awesome!
Yeah.
Kevin Smith was right.
No, but you know
what's
what's interesting about Arrow though, like starting off the DC universe, is he's so accessible. Like he shoots a bow and arrow and he can like do the salmon
He's
ladder.
been
He's
always
always
handsome, rich.
He's always been a Batman ripoff, like since his incarnation.
They
Since-
even the
the
creators
third
even
season is Batman begins with a whiter Ra's al Ghul.
Do they call it the
creators-
Arrow Cave?
Yes.
Yeah. And
It's called the Foundry. Like in the scripts, they have real names, but everyone calls it
the Arrow Cave. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think the creators even admitted, like, yeah, he was a complete Batman ripoff. We needed, like, our comic book publisher needed to compete, so we followed the exact.
Oh yeah.
Do you
Quick
remember?
question:
Like-
was he a national character or was he a DC? We're getting kind of
He's
inside.
in
We're gonna
DC,
get there.
I believe.
Because
they're
like
showing
I can't
clips,
remember
not
who of the World War II people.
I've
were
got a
like-
bit of. I got
That's
a
a great
bowl.
question.
Because like Wonder Woman and Parts of the Justice Society were
Yes.
definitely national periodical, which became indistinguishable from DC
We'll
almost immediately. Don't worry
we'll
about
get to
it.
that after the
Yeah.
show.
Shazam was definitely.
Shazam,
Fawcett?
and then
Oh, that's right. And they bought it when Fawcett went out of.
yeah, Fawcett.
Because they sued.
And then they
them.
were like, we're just gonna keep this other Superman around.
and then Charlton.
We gotta
like
do
the
a
Blue
whole
Beetle.
episode on the many Marvels, like because I just
Oh,
love
yeah.
that
Many
stuff.
Marvels.
It like when you can't use your own character's name because you sued him out of existence 70 years ago. That's only in comics.
I have some
Corporate.
dates. We're gonna get into that today.
Okay.
I have some, but like no, like so. There's Green Arrow.
Right, Arrow.
So there's Supergirl, Flash, Arrow, Legends of Tomorrow. Legends of Tomorrow has Adam, Citizen Steel,
he's just.
just Steel,
But like not the Superman
Vixen,
Steel.
no.
Okay,
Vixen.
Vixen,
Really?
White Canary,
Okay, I knew that one.
Heat
Firestorm,
Hawk Girl.
Heatwave,
Hawk
Girl, and Hawkman
thank
were
God,
last
went
season.
away.
No more Hawk. No
They
more.
were last season.
Boy, we're gonna have to cover that too. Wow. Okay. Yeah.
And yeah, both parts of Firestorm.
Yeah.
Because it's Jax and Martin Stein. I was going to say
Yeah.
Victor
So Arrow
Garber.
came
He
first?
plays
Victor
Victor
Garber,
Garber.
yeah.
But then there's also iZombie
Yes.
and Gotham that people are watching. and Black Lightning is coming.
And then
It's coming,
there was
yeah.
Constantine and
Yes.
That was on
That wasn't
Fox.
that wasn't
Lucifer's still on.
CW.
That was a real network.
Yeah,
I don't know.
who
They're
did-
all like
who did
Element OP.
Constantine?
They're all the same 5 letters.
Lucifer's still on. That's based on a Vertigo comic.
It just
Hellblazer,
got
which is based
renewed.
on. You guys just watched. We talked a lot about Vertigo.
Last week,
And then
Yeah.
he guest starred on
Hellblazer.
Green Arrow.
Yes,
on
That's
Arrow?
the thing. His
and-
show got canceled, but they did continued it with some animation, which they had also done with
On
Vixen.
He's
CW
also
Seed.
getting a series on CW Seed, and Matt Ryan just reprised the role in the Justice League Dark animated
my.
movie.
Oh, did he really?
Yeah, and it's awesome.
Is it really?
It's so
Oh, I
good.
It's amazing that DC is kind of doing with TV what Marvel, like, it's that they found TV as kind of their...
It's funny
their-
because it's what they've flipped. Marvel is not doing that. They're like, no, like our TV, we like pretended for a minute that it was, but now it's not.
It's totally not. Yeah.
And then we're definitely not letting Grant Gustin be in the Flash movie.
Yeah.
So here's an interesting. I agree or disagree, but like it's been talked
Disagree.
about a lot. Good, great, take a stand.
Typical white man.
No. It's been talked about a lot that like the Marvel movies, which I've been a big fan of, the Marvel Studios films. It's been discussed
love
a lot
Fan
that
Force
one of the. Oh, Fan Force. It's been spoken about a lot that like one of the challenges that ended up working in their favor was that Marvel Studios had sold off all its big names, so they had to work really hard to take characters who were technically like could have been considered second tier and sort of rehabilitate them and present them to the audience. And these were obviously characters who were legendary to us as comic book readers, but that weren't necessarily
Not to the
sure
general
things.
audience,
Like
yeah.
I bet they'll show up at a Captain America movie. Said no one in
Ever.
2006. Like,
Because we had 2 of them and they were bad.
And they were awful. Yeah.
so here's
I have a
is
distinct
DC
mem- oh.
TV the same thing?
Yes.
Is the
Yes.
CW basically like we can't use Superman, we
Well, 'cause
can't
they
really use Batman,
They almost did the
so
Suicide
work really
Squad.
hard.
They established the Suicide Squad on Arrow, and it seemed really likely that it was going to spin off. And then they were like, "Psych, we got a Suicide Squad movie, and you can't have any of these
Well,
people anymore."
And my feelings on like I'm not a I will say I'm not a big fan of these shows just because I only have so much time to watch television. But like I
Put
pop
Flash
in.
at the top of your list.
Oh no, Flash, and then like Supergirl. I every time I poke in, I go, oh wow, it's not even the Supergirl I read in the comics. It's you figured out how to do a Superman on TV that no one's gonna. It's just like they just made Superman into Supergirl, and it's the best Superman that's been on film or television since Christopher Reeve. It's the Superman
It's
I've been waiting
definitely
for.
the hairiest Superman that's been on TV since
Boom.
Christopher
Thank
Reeve.
you.
Because Tyler Eklund, oh boy.
Well, not him, but like she's the best.
But you're
Superman.
looking
Yeah,
at the
yeah,
show
yeah,
as sort of
yeah.
a Superman family
Yeah.
kind of show.
They turned
and
her
that-
into
yes,
Superman,
yeah.
like full on. It's everything
she's
I
not
want.
that different from the run when I started was Sterling Gates writing
Yeah.
for DC, and it's pretty close to that incarnation. But like they definitely like they've been making excellent use of the Superman environments and villains and stories.
And
She does find a lot of Superman villains. I mean, I know Supergirl obviously doesn't have the same level of rogues gallery that he does, but like all of the greatest hit Superman villains that are like you're never going to see Mr. Mixie
Mitzelplicknick.
Spuddy-
I can say it,
Mitzelplicknick.
sparkly
Mitzelplicknick.
guy. So they just put him on the show, and that was really cool because like he's never going to work
No.
in a movie.
Which breaks my
Which
heart.
was heartbreaking. 'cause I love
Because
that.
that's what I love about Superman.
Then you need to read Superman Reborn right
I'm
now.
already well. That's where we're going.
That brings us, yeah. So those are the like, and what did they just greenlight something else beyond?
Probably.
There's Black Lightning.
there's
coming.
Black Lightning.
Zombie's still going. Which
They were
is
talking
not
about a
DC
Titans
universe, but
show, but that got pushed
the Titans
to
show
the
keeps
side.
coming on and off the radar.
Yeah, they were supposed to relaunch that with what's the Teen Wolf Nugget who was in Arrow, and then he
You
left. He's
Did you
like
just call him a nugget?
he's
Nugget.
like 5.5 feet tall.
Adorable.
The guy who plays Roy, yeah.
Robert?
When he left, there was a lot of rumors swirling around that it was because he was going to go launch Titans, and then that fell through, and then it went to TNT of all networks,
I'm
Yeah.
Yeah.
and then that
more of a
fell
Speedy
through.
fan myself, anyway. I'm always.
I would agree.
Oh, we'll get to that. Oh, so no, we don't. We're getting too inside
Wait,
baseball.
wait,
It's so
yep.
very us, and it's also very DC. So a little bit about DC Comics, just to sort of set up the stage.
They're a
What's
comic
a
book
DC
publisher.
Comics?
What
They
is
are
a comic?
They are a comic book. Is a series of pictures with text. No, okay. So DC Comics. I'm going to put this up here because it's just such a good.
Yeah.
Was home of some of the biggest superheroes that we had. It was DC Comics was National Allied Comics originally, 1934, before renaming themselves Detective Comics or DC Comics, based off of the book that Batman was created in. Superman was created in Action Comics. There were a few others, but they are Green Lantern, Flash, Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, Martian
The Golden
Manhunter,
Ages?
Black Canary.
Black Canary. Basically everything that you really know if you're not a big comic fan that isn't Marvel. Like
Everything that isn't Spider-Man.
everything
is
isn't
DC.
Spider-Man.
Yeah.
DC.
And not the X-Men.
Right. Yeah, Spider-Man and the X-Men, those are the two.
And
If Marvel Studios owns the rights to it, it's none of those.
It's none of those.
It's all the others.
and
That's a really good way to put it.
yeah, and
Yeah.
DC Comics came first. They were the first big superhero producers, and they a lot of their characters, they didn't have a shared universe. They were not doing, this was before shared universe or continuity was a thing.
This
much
was
like
before
movies.
you even had a standalone story. You were buying an anthology, and they would put Batman on the cover because he was the bestseller. You got 11 pages of Batman, and then you got like a cowboy story, and
And
then
we've talked about this
something
sort of,
else people in the 50s like.
we've
Yeah.
talked about this sort of structure of these
Romance.
before, where like
Yeah,
there's a
romance.
reason
There you go.
you didn't know if a book with a character's name on it would sell. So what you do is say something like, we'll tell different kind of detective stories, and you have Detective Comics 1 through 26 with just different stuff going on, and then you're like, somebody had an idea for this kind of vigilante character. Detective Comics 27, now extremely famous and extremely expensive. They
Yeah.
introduced this Batman guy. In some cases, they get it right out the gate. Action Comics #1, they were like, here's our idea. It's Superman.
Yeah.
We just
What a
invented
cover.
comics. Boom.
Yeah.
So here's a quick question: was Action Comics was that its own publishing company apart from DC, or
No.
was that like
no, that was national
was-
before it renamed
it
itself.
was national?
And
Okay.
there was a point, what I
Yeah.
meant to allude to earlier, was some point in World War II era where like National and DC were sort of coexisting, but they were technically different branches. And then they got
Yes.
folded back in later, but that's not something to really
It's like
worry
more
about.
like Dimension Films in October. Like it was like
They were, like,
weird. They
working
were
out of the
playing
same
with
offices,
things.
Like
but
the
they were
same
technically-
shingle?
And all the same people were working on them, but they had different stamps on the cover.
It's
And-
comics.
And as comic books came under scrutiny by the feds, things slowly condensed. And also, I'll say like you made characters like Superman. There were a whole bunch of pretenders. Superman was a big hit, so we got a lot of Superman-like characters, including Captain Marvel, who was sued for being too much like Superman
By DC.
By DC. And then later DC bought Captain Marvel.
Yep, they put him out of business, and then they bought
Bought
him,
them.
but in the meantime, other people were using the name, and it's hilarious.
Yes.
And
It's sad, but
yeah, and
hilarious.
then Marvel
Mostly
sued
hilarious.
DC for having a character named Captain Marvel that they bought from somebody they sued out of existence.
Captain Marvel's a
Comics.
very
Captain
Very
Marvel
tumultuous
and,
title.
and
I
Miracle
love
Man.
it.
Do we
Yeah.
even think it's that good a name, really, in the pantheon?
Apparently it's worth fighting
of
Okay,
over.
okay.
names?
Whiz Comics. Do you remember that was the name of the book?
Yep,
Whiz,
Whiz
Comics.
And it was
I
supposed to be
love
Captain
it.
Billy's Whiz Bang.
Oh my
Captain
God.
Billy's Whiz Bang.
That's like a Harry Potter level nonsense title.
Fantastic.
Captain Marvel is one of like I have a big love of the Marvel family.
The Marvel family.
And now it's the Shazam. They're called Shazam now because of the legal reasons.
Two sort of elements of controversy there are one, whether like to us now the similarities that they sued over seem trivial because basically everyone in the universe has those similarities.
Yeah.
At the time they were sort of like, I don't know, the idea of a really strong guy, he's also really strong.
That much.
Coincidence? But a lot of things like
Well, it
got-
was the spit curl reel.
Yeah.
it was a lot of things, but it was interesting because a lot of elements, like there was a period of time where the Captain Marvel books were outselling Superman. You don't sue them unless it's working.
Yeah.
And a bunch of elements made up for the Captain Marvel family got re-imported into the Superman books. Like what if we had 1 million family members in various versions of it hanging around? So
Super Horse and
Comics-
Super Cat.
it's a brilliant thing. Like comics feed on each other, often in very positive ways, and sometimes in negative ways when they do a race to the bottom, which will come up later.
Come up later.
But like in a lot of good ways, the sort of creativity can rub off on the other comics. I went off on a tangent.
Oh no, it was a good tangent.
And it continues to this very day.
Yep.
what
But
her
so-
tangent.
yes.
Yeah, it's the never-ending
Exactly.
story.
Speaking of which,
Tangent
there's-
Comics. Another thing, but like, so we have DC Comics is doing well. They've got Batman. Batman also had Pretenders as well, but known quite so famous. Black Bat was one that there was a whole series of like weird,
Black
even
Beetle
bat
as
like
well.
Black Beetle.
One of the things I found interesting about Batman, and this is like a Grant it's Morrison's Super Gods, where he talks about how Superman comes along, starts selling incredibly well, and the people at DC are like, we've got to compete with this Superman character. So the creators of Batman, Bob Kane, like looks at it, he's like,
and Bill Finger.
Bill Fingers, thank you. And
It's another one of those mental
I
buttons.
know, good button.
they look at it and they go, well, everyone else is just copying Superman. They're selling well, but like, what's the opposite of Superman? And that's how they created Batman, at least from what I remember from Super Gods.
And that's a bit of the spirit too, like
Where it's like Superman fights in the day, Batman fights at night. Like, so what are the elements of a guy who fights at night versus a guy who fights in the day? Like, And like if you
It's all
hold it
jewel
up,
thieves.
With like doing this.
Yeah.
And it should be established that, like, in these early days, they were making it up as they went. There was no such thing as a comic book the way we think of them today when Action Comics 1 was published.
Yeah, they were just like
Batman
funny
shoots
pages,
guys
yeah.
and throws them off buildings.
It's an evolving story. He then gets Robin pretty quickly, and you're
In
like,
39,
that's
I believe.
interesting.
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, that's
but so-
reasons.
There had been, like, reprints of newspaper funnies. There had been some of those, and then they were sort of like, what if we did original stuff? And, like, Action Superman was a pitch for a newspaper comic that got turned down, and they were like, paste it onto pages.
Yeah,
Done.
Superman was turned down a lot before somebody picked him up and was like, "This guy who jumps over stuff, great."
What did they pay him for that Superman story? Like
$100.
It was like
$100 for the
200,
license, I
100.
believe. Yeah.
Pretty lame.
Yeah.
Man.
But nobody knew it would work. And
Exactly.
these companies
And
were in the money-making
They were
business,
inventing the media.
And
the
they-
medium.
So I think DC also probably gets credit for, is Justice Society considered first super team?
Yes.
Yes.
This was a World War II era, like, we've got a bunch of pretty popular characters, and this was initially
There's
not
a
like
beautiful
Superman and Batman because
painted-
it was the other half of the
There's a
company.
beautiful painted Alec Ross Justice Society photo somewhere in there that hopefully will pop up in the
But so
second.
yeah, World War II, they were like,
Yeah.
let's
There we
put a
are.
bunch of the characters together. Wonder Woman will be the secretary.
Yeah.
Including the All-Star Squadron, which was my favorite iteration of this, which was the World War II. We need all the superheroes to fight World War II, and they created a government registry, but like it was back when there was like, that sounds great, and so all the superheroes like, we'd be happy to lend a hand, and it was like they
Well, that
literally.
was when we believed in things.
Yeah, it was, and they had to come up with like weird, convoluted reasons why we still won the war, like just barely. Like they had to come up with a whole reason why they couldn't just end World War II with superheroes
Side note,
But
was
without
All-Star-
giving the Nazi superheroes.
without giving. They gave them a couple, but
Was All-Star Squadron actually in World War II, or was it added into
Post.
mythology later?
I believe it was
I
post.
love this stuff. Okay, so you get DC's wonderful for this, where it's like certain things actually did happen in the 40s. They were publishing Justice Society comics, but like you'll see that later on they try to incorporate that period of time in other things. I'm getting ahead of
So-
myself.
in the same
let
way
me-
that Sergeant Rock will appear in different
yeah.
Yeah.
battles throughout history.
Let me ask this. As an idiot, All-Star Squadron.
All-Star
I know the
Squadron.
title.
Uh-huh.
Explain it to me.
It was. It's literally just it was the president and Congress enacting a law.
Was that one of the times where they used the actual president?
They did. It was. I'm trying to remember which president it was who was
Only
like
issues of All-Star
Roosevelt?
Squadron I've
Was
read.
it
in.
Roosevelt? It was
American.
Roosevelt. Saying I
It
believe
was either him or Truman.
was basically saying we need
Uncle
all.
Sam wants you to save
yeah,
the world.
was the
so
All-Star
awesome.
Squadron was like just we need everybody. Liberty Bell, like some amazingly
AKA
ridiculous.
Jesse Quick.
Jesse Quick. Oh, Jesse Quick's mom over
So
there.
is
Oh,
this
true.
Yeah.
Very true.
is this
Sometimes people are
Earth
their own
1,
mothers.
Earth
Welcome
2,
to
Earth
DC.
3?
Oh
Earth
boy,
four?
we're gonna get into Earth.
Black
Okay,
Because
so,
I don't think that's an Earth 1, right? Like that.
That's Earth. Okay, we're gonna get into
we'll
Earth.
get there, we'll get there.
This
So
is
then we
why
shunted everything
when
we didn't
friends
like
tried
over
to get me to
here.
read DC Comics when I was a teenager, they would start explaining this to me, and my head would start leaking out my ears and be like, "Nope, not
No,
going
see,
there."
I promise
Mine
it's
still
beautiful.
does.
I promise it's
So-
beautiful. It's worth it.
They had all of these books that didn't really. Sometimes they would have weird crossovers, but they were just pretending that they were separate books. Like it would be like if
They were usually
Angel.
for annuals because they had a fifth week that they had to fill with content.
Yeah, and like if like the character Buffy randomly showed up on Flash.
Yeah.
And like with no connection to continuity, nor would any vampire ever be mentioned
Oh,
again.
that's a great example actually, because it would be as if you were making multiple shows, but you had a vampire storyline come up on Supernatural, and you had a show called Buffy, and if you were you were making both of those, but you didn't care if the rules for vampires were different on Supernatural
Yeah.
than they were on Buffy, because they were different shows.
'Cause
and
it
what's
doesn't
the big
matter.
deal? Like,
Well, didn't Supernatural and Vampire Diaries run concurrently for a long time?
I think they did.
You are such nerds. Oh my god.
Wow.
No, we're extremely cool, Taliesin. Don't out us on
This
the
is the
internet.
cool club. This is the cool club.
Molly the
Renaming the
techie,
show.
I agree. My brain is melting also.
So,
Oh no, I'm so
all
sorry.
right, here we go.
promise it's worth
That's
I'm
it.
reeling it in.
Wikipedia's for.
I'm reeling it in. In 19... Oh, god, Wiki is no help here. There's
It's
no
so funny
saving.
because like I'm listening to this going, yeah, there's a reason I love Marvel. Wait, no, Marvel's just
So-
as
We're
bad.
just as
Uh,
bad.
yeah.
Just
It's
used to
not.
it.
So-
It's like fish in water. You don't see it.
In 1961,
Yes.
DC had bought a bunch of characters from other companies. Like they just every time a company folded, they just cherry picked what they liked, including like
They're a publishing company.
yeah, they bought the
What you
Charlton
do.
Comics characters, which were really cool. They bought the Fawcett characters,
Charlton
and
characters, some of whom you'll know the names of, like Blue
Blue
Beetle.
Beetle.
Blue Beetle,
A
or
lot of
the
whom
Question.
kind of moved over into Earth 2 for a while.
Well, we'll get to it.
get to it.
So in 1961, they took their new Flash, which was selling very well.
We should maybe really
Well,
quickly,
yeah, go ahead.
the new Flash is kind of a big deal.
So all the original DC characters were old.
Old.
And then they were like, we need to make them new and
60s.
sexy. And Jay Garrick was too old. So they
Very
stopped
old.
coloring his hair gray and called him Barry Allen.
Well, a lot of it, like you were getting into the moral panic of the 50s hit comics really hard, and a lot of the other genres that had been keeping everybody afloat folded. And so the thing that sort of came along to rescue American comics was the reemergence and reinvention of superhero comics, and DC gets starting credit for that.
No,
they were
Yes.
like 5 years ahead of the curve. In 1956,
And
they
they-
were like, "We'll bring this World War II Flash character back," but none of those kids remember the old Flash, so we'll just make a new one.
Yeah, and they
We're
made a
fine
new
with it.
Green
Green
Lantern
Lantern,
and a
yeah.
new and the brilliant thing they did with these guys is they gave them very, very bright color. Like the original costumes were a little bit less costumey and more uniformy because it was wartime. Like Alan Scott had a cape, but he also wore like a shirt, not
Yeah.
like a spandex and pants, which was a thing. And the Flash wore jeans. Jay Garrick wore a pair of jeans.
But you would also make army uniforms out of jeans. So it wasn't even this weird casual thing they were doing. Like Captain America's uniform, which they do in the movie so excellently, would have been made out of denim.
Yeah.
So
So with all that happening, and the first thing they do is they start putting the logos in circles so they can copyright them. That is very specific. That the logos were like the original Flash just had a lightning bolt.
Yep.
And Green Lantern just had like a weird. I mean, I think they did end up copyrighting it, but they had. That's why Batman went into the yellow circle.
I did not know
But
that.
Wait,
so
not
that-
because you're trying
Wait,
to draw
because,
enemy
like-
fire?
I know.
Wait, because if it's in a circle, you can copyright it. If
Yes.
it's out of a circle, you
That's
can't.
just a bat.
Yes, that used to be.
That's
That
just
used to
a-
be like
can't copyright a
logo
bat.
copyright laws.
So it's
because
like
it used to
because
make,
you have to
know,
have a shield, like right? Like you have
You
to have.
it has to have a border, like a
Yeah.
defined
Huh.
border. It can't just be like that's a lightning bolt.
You
That's
can't
awesome.
go
So
all
could it-
lightning
yeah.
bolts.
Could it be a square?
Like,
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Had
it's
to be
not
enclosed.
circle specific, but it has to be enclosed.
But there were a lot of circles.
Wow, so-
There was the circle
No, no, I
and
get
then the
this.
shield.
Bizarro would have gone well with a big S in the square, I think.
Yes, I agree.
We'll get to Bizarro.
so what happened in 1961? I
So
interrupted you.
they started playing. They had all of these new character reboots, and they're like, we need more characters. We were just going to sell more and more superhero books. We still have all the old characters, so they start figuring out a way to bring the old versions of the characters to meet the new versions, and so they create Earth 1 and Earth 2. Now,
This
two
changed comics
Earths,
forever.
2 dimensions. They were separated by dimensions. They were Marvel has one, but they orbit the sun differently. It's a whole thing.
No, that's a whole other thing.
That's a whole other
That's-
thing.
Because there was Marvel 1610 and Marvel 616, and then there was
Remind me to bring in that paper. for
the
you.
other, what was it? Alter Earth or
Well, we won't break them. We won't break them. So,
yeah, sorry,
Right.
No
So
Marvel.
close already.
So-
high evolutionary, yeah.
Earth 1 was not the oldest Earth. That was our current Earth. And Earth 2 was the older Earth. And so they started putting all the, like, Earth 2 was in, like, perpetual World War II.
Have you?
Sort of.
There's a different world that's still fighting it, but like it's behind us.
Yes.
Is the idea that, and this makes a certain amount of sense if you think that, like, okay, you've got a brand new Flash, he's super popular.
It's a brilliant marketing strategy.
Yeah, you've got a brand new Green Lantern, he's super popular. You've taken those new characters and the ones who you never stopped publishing, like Superman and Batman and Wonder Woman, and you've made a new super team, Justice League. But you have these sort of other versions from the past, and it starts with Flash, which
Yeah.
is one of the reasons I'm so fond of, like, the Flash TV show.
Actually
Setting
did
the
the-
course for, like, all of comics is so perfect because Flash really laid the groundwork for so much of this stuff.
Yeah.
And it was, the idea was, like, Flash could do all kinds of weird stuff with his super speed, and they thought, like, well, this new Flash is such a hit, what if he met that dude from the old version? And so, like, it was just supposed to be, I think, probably just a one-off story of, like, the Flash of two worlds. It was like, what if they met each other? And people flipped out, and they wrote crazy letters, and they were like, give us more, give us more, give us more.
They recreated the cover of it when Jay Garrick, that was one of the Flash episodes.
Yes.
So they actually recreated, like, both of them coming around.
Do you
With
know
the
where
brick
right?
wall,
Stop. Nice.
Do you know why they called it the Justice League? Because they didn't think that the children would know what a society was, but they would know what a league
League.
was.
Well, that makes sense.
Well, because Major League Baseball, I think, was a big impetus for that. But I'm like,
Sure.
I don't know what a league is. It's what you measure the C with.
But so,
We got 20,000 of them.
But you're
right
from
over here.
Canada.
I am. I go metric all the
I was
time.
going to say, what a Canadian league.
All right, I don't mean to hurt any of you, but the
No,
chat
bring
is
it.
the chat is still saying that their brains are hurting.
Yes, we know. There's no way not to make this
And,
hurt.
Drink
and
more
I
coffee.
have I have
Novocaine.
to agree. My brain is also hurting.
So-
And I know this stuff more or less, but like all the details, I'm just like,
So
But
this
if you
is
think about it, like
incredible.
the ones that are your new big hits, they would be Earth One, right? You don't want to
course.
be like, hey, everything we're reading counts less. You want to be like, the books you're buying right now, this is the main world.
Yep.
Barry Allen, he's the main Flash.
And you have to
but
remember-
we can use this other stuff.
no one had done this before. There was no precedent for this. Nothing like it had ever happened. They were experimenting wildly, and part of the problem with this sort of serialized storytelling is, by the very nature of it, is that they hadn't even learned how to undo mistakes yet.
Yeah.
It was, if you do something, it's true. It's the worst. It's the most complicated yes and game ever.
But it also begins the idea of I never understand why people get all butthurt about canon and when things change in canon, because as a fan, especially with comics, you have to build your own continuity. And if you think about, if your favorite character is Jay Garrick and he's shunted off to Earth 2, I mean, you don't have to accept that. And this is the beginning of like, screw you and your reboots. I'm going to build whatever I want inside my brain.
Oh.
Tim Drake will always be
Tim
Robin.
Cannon.
So
Tim Drake will always be. No, I like him.
This was the 60s saw like an explosion in sort of the culture of reading comics, and you by the end of the decade you've got the first conventions, like real proper comic conventions, and like fan magazines and all of this stuff, which oddly would give rise to a new generation of writers who,
Sure.
unlike the folks who came before them, really did care about what happened in the other issues.
Yeah.
They were like, well, if they're vampires here, they should work the same way as here, or we should have an explanation. And you get sort of the birth of this idea that, like, rather than every story living and dying on its own, you can get richer stories if you make everything count and find ways for it to count.
Interestingly, a shift that you'll see copied when Deep Space Nine comes on the air in television serialized storytelling.
Oh man. So, and then because of this, we have our two Earths now with the old heroes and the new heroes, and
All right,
it's also
so
great because
before
parents were reading these books before, and now the kids had I mean, they also there was a good parent-child dynamic that happened out of this
before
too.
you go on,
Yes,
Earth 2
Earth 2.
has Alan Ladd, the original is
Alan Scott.
Alan Scott. Sorry, Alan Ladd. Alan Scott, the original Green Lantern. Jay Garrick, the original Flash.
A different Superman who's older.
An older Superman.
An older Superman.
Dinah Lance, original Black Canary.
Okay,
Might have-
and who else?
Sometimes it's called Dinah.
This is
Lance.
all Earth 2.
Dr. Fate.
The Hawks.
Dr. Fate,
The
Hawks.
Hawkman.
Hawkman and Hawkgirl.
Yeah.
Okay.
The
All
tiny Atom, not the tiny Atom, the just short and has an attitude Atom.
And I think all the Charlton characters.
Starman? No.
I think eventually
No.
they might end up there, but when
Not yet.
they first established the idea of Earth 2, when they first established the idea of Earth 2, we were basically reaching back into like their own company circa 1943.
Yes. No, I get that. I'm
Red
trying to like
Bee.
put the audience is saying, thank you, Matt, for answering.
Yeah.
So I'm
This is what
doing-
you're here for.
All the
This is why I'm here.
characters you
Here,
don't
so-
care about live on Earth too.
Yeah.
So in Earth
Parents
2
care.
is
Yeah.
Justice Society of America.
Yes.
Okay. Justice Society of America, did that predate Justice League?
Yes.
Yes.
Correct? When did
Yes.
Justice Society of America come out?
40s.
40s.
The 40s. Okay.
Actual World War II is when they were being published by real company DC/National in real world Earth.
Is
or
that
Earth
when they
Prime.
fought Starro?
No, that's the Justice League.
in
That's
their
the
first
Justice
ever
League.
appearance.
Okay,
Yeah.
So,
So-
think 40s and 60s.
40s and
The
60s.
60s are
Yes.
then looking back at the 40s and scooping up their characters, some of whom, unfortunately, or fortunately, exist in both versions.
Yeah.
Yes.
So there's two
and,
Supermen now.
and that's what I'm trying to get at.
Or if you
There's
like to
two
think about it-
Supermans, one's old, one's young.
Yeah.
Earth 1 is the young one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's Golden Age versus Silver.
Silver Age, yeah.
Yep.
So that's what I'm trying to do for the audience
Thank
is
you.
here's who the Golden Age characters
No.
are. Here's the no, don't stop. Okay.
No,
No, they go to the Justice Society of
I-
America. Silver Age, Superman, Batman,
The
Wonder
kids you
Woman,
know.
the kids you know, and they are in the Justice League, and their first appearance is fighting Starro.
Yep.
Yes.
Okay.
So they
Did that help?
Aquaman.
Did I do it? Are there any more
So
questions
Thank
about
you
that?
so much.
Yes.
So what's great is like, and this is a thing I hope you don't mind, but like when I first got into DC, I came to it kind of late. One of the things that like made me fall madly in love with the universe, and we all love the characters, we knew them from other media and all this stuff, but like comic book DC, I fell in love with by reading the collections of the annual crossovers.
Oh.
They are collected as Crisis on Multiple Earths.
Yes.
Because this Flash crossover, this thing where they were like, what if we had our new Flash meet our old Flash? Eventually someone was like, what if you had your new super team meet your old super team?
In a seance.
And it was
Well,
And I
Miss
think
I thought that's what
was
that was.
the whole thing.
Was the original? Correct me if I'm wrong. Was the original one Crisis on Earth 3? Because essentially they said if we've got
Yes.
this
Yeah, 'cause
version
that
and
Or
that
Earth 3
version,
became Criminal Earth.
Yeah,
But
because Earth 3
it
eventually
was-
became Crime Syndicate Earth.
But
We'll
no,
get to
that
that.
was it. Like it was us, the good guys and the bad guys, and the evil versions.
Yes.
Or like the good guys and
Yeah,
the
yeah.
other good guys, and like having to team up to fight evil versions of themselves. And it was it was Justice League, I don't know,
So-
21, 16,
Yeah.
something pretty early. But like, we should look it up.
We should look at
What
I
it
knew it
did
would be
was
this way.
people loved it. They were like, okay, I get it. Here's my Justice League. Here's the things my older brother or my parents were reading, who I can find in back issue bins, and that's kind of fun. And here's like other new dangers, and there's a crisis they all have to solve together. And it became essentially the big summer event. Was that DC would have their Justice League meet the Justice Society, almost like an annual family reunion.
Welcome to
Yeah.
the beginning of event fatigue.
Yeah. It's one of those, and thus were born the beauties and the dangers of this kind of storytelling.
Yeah.
Because it can, like, what's great is reading those over time.
Oh,
You
yeah.
can see, you get this snapshot of the DC universe one year at a time for 2.5 decades.
That's so
And-
nicely put.
And slowly,
But you
slowly it
see
becomes
Black
the end of
Canary.
July. We're like, if I go to one more wedding, I swear to God, I'm gonna. Yeah.
Like, for instance, a character like Black Canary, who was originally a Golden Age character and who'd been on the Justice Society side, ultimately crossed over. She stayed behind on one of those trips because she was so cool and popular that they were like, we want to use her in our regular comics. We don't want
Yeah.
to see her once a year. She became a
that was
staple
when,
member.
she
Yeah.
had
And who
black
was
hair
that?
too.
Black Canary.
Black Canary.
Started at
Dinah
one.
Drake, who then became Dinah Lance,
Lance.
and then left her police chief husband behind to take her baby to Earth 1 to become the new sexy Black Canary who marries Oliver Queen.
I think originally he had died. In the when it first went down,
Yeah,
the
yeah,
idea
but in
was
a
she was like, I'm a
retcon,
widow,
she
I have
was-
nothing to live for.
Yes.
Like not nothing to live for, but she's like, I'm a widow, I
Nothing
see
to
an
live for. We're
opportunity.
defined by marriage.
Green Arrow, super sexy. Let me cross universes. So,
I mean, have you seen the salmon ladders? He's pretty sexy.
So with all this happening, we had our two Earths, and they have all these other characters from all these other companies that they also want to bring in on this, and things start to go a little crazy. I just made a couple of notes because
Yeah.
They start.
everything till now was normal.
because
It's been
normal.
It's been
You
very
know that
normal
dog
waters.
who's in that room that's on fire? This
That-
is fine.
That's an Earth. Dog on Fire is Earth
Dog on
497.
Fire.
It's
Yeah,
just
yeah.
a dog on a planet on fire.
There's only 52 Earths.
Well, not yet. This is back then. Back then, there were
Touche.
hundreds. They started making more and more Earths, and there's Earth Zero, which was the Bizarro Earth, where everyone was a weird, like, zombie
Earth was a cube.
opposite person, and it was a cube.
That's like the best thing about Bizarro, right?
Yeah,
Is
it's
that
a
it's a
cube.
cube.
There
That was always my favorite too.
Yeah.
There was Earth Prime, which was our Earth, where everything was normal and all the superheroes were comic books except for Superboy.
That's why nobody likes it.
So wait,
Eventually they were like-
Superboy's real?
Oh boy, we'll get there.
Can of worms.
Can of worms. And
So
then
you can track this by it's the golden age and everyone's writing stories sort of one at a time where they assume kids will find one issue. They don't assume you've read the old saying, every comic is someone's first, comes from these
Yeah.
days. They assume that you want Batman to basically seem like Batman, but that you're not paying close attention and that you're not getting every issue in order. So you go from essentially assuming no one will really care about these details to it's so cool if we start incorporating these details to now it gets out of hand because if you constantly iterate on that, it gets really
And you know what's going to
complicated.
fix that? The anti-monitor.
Crisis
You don't believe me, but it's coming.
1986.
You were listing off the weird Earths, though. We can have like.
Oh,
there's
that
not
was
the
as
Earth,
far. I was
there's,
like, I was just gonna do like Crime Syndicate. There's like, there
Is
are.
that Earth 3?
That was Earth 3.
Traditionally, yeah.
The original Earth 3 wasn't, but then they turned Earth 3 into Crime Syndicate Earth. Although it's now not even its own Earth. Now it's just the antimatter universe.
There's
That's
also
fine.
an awesome joke in the first Supergirl Flash crossover where he's explaining all of the different Earths, and she goes,
He does
"What
it pretty
about
well.
an Earth where there's all a bunch of bad guys?" And he's like, "Yeah, been there. That sucks."
Yeah. That's the Crime Syndicate Earth, and I'm a big fan of Crime Syndicate.
So am I. Like, that's why I was like, I think that's Earth 3. I think I know this
The
one.
Evil Justice League is the Crime Syndicate.
You like
It
James,
start out
James
as Earth
Wood?
3. I think it's the. Okay,
So
Is that the Earth where Bruce Wayne's mom becomes the Joker?
different.
different Earth.
Different. Okay.
Flashpoint.
Really good.
Bruce
story,
Wayne's
though.
dead.
Is that
in Crime Syndicate Earth.
Flashpoint?
Yeah.
It's Flashpoint.
Okay.
It's
That's
the best
it, yeah.
part of Flashpoint.
Bruce Wayne's dead. in
Yeah.
Crime Syndicate Earth.
Yes.
These are the
Barry
things I
Allen
know.
missed his mom, so he ran back in time.
So there's a mess
Always
now.
works out great.
There's a mess that no one can
gonna do
keep
it
track of anymore, and it's huge. And we have Crisis. We do the first reboot.
This was the there's no way to overstate what an event this was.
And how important it was for all the good and bad that comes out of it.
Yep.
So sometimes you hear this phrase pre-crisis and post-crisis DC, and that's where this comes from, because Crisis on Infinite Earths completely solidifies what the actual continuum is, what the actual mythology is. This is basically
one story which is supposed to change. It's one story which is supposed to change all of those decades of like very complicated history in one stroke. And the Crisis name, as you may have noticed from early, like is already kind of a brand thing for DC because they had started out their annual picnic things with that Crisis on Earth 3, and they would revisit. They'd be like, because everyone loves to call back to what they've done, so it's like Crisis on Earth S, Crisis blah 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 blah. And so this was them being like, all right, this is going to be the ultimate one. This is going to be the thing these stories have given us an incredibly loyal fan base and a bunch of rich stories, but they're out of hand and no one can keep track of it. What if we do one story that changes our whole reality?
There were too many Earths, and so the Antimatter ate them and pooped out one Earth.
Well, when you put
Spoilers
it like
for
that.
Crisis on Infinite Earth.
Yeah, that's pretty much.
That's our show, everybody. Thanks for joining.
Book drop.
As she solved it.
There you go.
But
If you like the Antimatter, watch Green Lantern the Animated Series Season 2.
he's kind of funky. He looks like the villain from Toy Story, really. Like the
Zurg?
Yeah, but like
Zurg,
Yeah.
Evil Emperor Zurg.
Maybe not a coincidence.
Maybe not.
All right,
I
so
would say no.
People are nerds.
So I'm going to do my best because I know
You're killing it. Thank you
people's
so much
brains
for
are
being
hurting.
here.
No, this is hard to follow.
So I'm
we're
going to do
deep.
my best to catch you up
fully
based on my
recommend
understanding. You
working
guys
at a
please
comic
correct
shop.
me if
my
I'm
God.
incorrect. Okay, so DC Comics starts off, there's action, there's DC, there's Charlton, there's all these other wacky comics out there. DC absorbs all of them. They have all these weird, wacky characters. They have a golden age, they have a silver age. When they hit the silver age, I feel like I'm doing like who's on first.
You're
what's
good,
on
you're
second.
good.
It's wonderful. It's great.
When you hit the silver age, they're like, hey, we should revamp all these
That's
characters.
like at the end of the Silver Age.
Yeah, at the end of the Silver
Bronze
Age.
Age.
So they bring in younger versions of the older characters from the Golden Age.
Okay,
But,
that,
like,
that actually
that's the
is
beginning
Silver
of-
Age.
yeah.
Silver
That
Age
is,
is
that's,
like
that's what I'm saying.
Sorry,
When
I
you get to the Silver
I thought
Age,
you meant
you
Crisis.
Sometimes
Barry
with,
Allen.
with only the name in common. Sometimes
Yeah.
nothing else.
of course. So you get Barry Allen, you
Hal
get
Jordan.
Hal
Hal
Jordan, you get a younger Superman than the older Superman, but anyway.
they just
so-
sort of carried on with that and pretended
Yes.
it was
With the
part of the new
Trinity,
thing.
yeah.
Yeah.
But they're still not 100% beholden to continuity. They're still like, hey, here's a one-off, here's a one-off, here's a one-off,
even
here's
a
a
little,
one-off.
not
Work
even a
in
little.
progress.
They're getting there.
Silver
Yeah.
Age is where it starts.
So
really,
Silver
like-
Age is very much a transition period from we don't give a flying F about continuity to oh my god, we care about continuity, so
continuity
that
porn,
by
yeah.
the time they get to the end of the Silver Age, they are cranking out as much continuity as they can in their continuity
it's
engine
not even given
when
F.
it didn't exist before.
It's not even given F. It's what's continuity.
Sure,
Yeah, nobody had.
sure.
That's
Yeah.
very fair because there
That's fair.
was no continuity in film and TV and I don't know theater. What did people
If you-
do
if
in
you-
the
if-
30s?
if you-
I don't know.
If you went to Warner Brothers and told them that Starcross had to fit into the Buffy universe, like you would be looked like all your WB shows have to take place on the same planet Earth. They would look at you like you're a crazy person 10 years ago. Now they would be like, man, if only we could do that.
Yeah, and like the
So it's-
cinematic
these
craze very
companies
much.
are currently doing to movies and television what they did to comics,
Comics in
and what
the
you
60s.
see is the wonderful, rich possibilities you get, but also the attendant problems of having large, complex, moving parts universes.
Very true. So the 60s is let's build a continuity engine and crank out continuity by cranking all this stuff together, creating new Earths to explain all these disparate parts, and moving forward.
I'll change one. I'll change one word only because it's important. It's not let's build a continuity engine. It's let's cobble one.
Okay, cobble.
Let's assemble.
The 60s,
Yeah.
something else happened with Crisis, which was Marvel.
Okay, well, before we get to that, let
Yeah.
me summarize what DC's doing. So, then all these writers for the next 10, 15 years are like, continuity, but it's like going in
25,
all these
really.
like 25
Like
years.
60 to the
but
mid-80s.
it's a lightning branch of continuity. And so 1985, 86? 86 happens, and the editorial staff at DC says, hey, let's put a giant 100% stamp on what we say is the continuity. It's very much like the canonization of the Bible in the 500s.
It's actually
it's very much
They're-
actually
they're
like that.
separate-
though.
Arguably
Arguably
text.
equally as important.
Actually,
But like because like I mean this is the seminarian in me coming out. You have Gospel of Thomas. You have like 5 or 6 different versions of the Gospel of Matthew. You have like 1,000 letters of Paul, but which ones are the official ones that the church recognizes?
Vatican
so
II electric
DC,
boogaloo.
exactly. So DC basically has their Vatican and says,
Yes.
boom, here's our characters, here's our stories, post-crisis, go.
Which is
Yes.
and post crisis is really comic book code for apocrypha.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Does that explain everything?
No.
Or pseudopocrypha would be the technical
Apocrypha
term.
would be things that were rendered not in continuity by the events of Crisis. Post-Crisis, we usually use to just mean something that chronologically happened afterwards.
Yeah.
Fair.
I'm just
yeah,
to
fair. Just to
like-
but like the editorial of it. Yeah.
So in some ways, pre-crisis would be considered apocrypha because the Gospel of Thomas is an apocryphal book because it goes against the canon.
Sure.
It existed. People
Established by the
regarded it as
church.
real at the
I love the
time,
word
but later
apocrypha.
it was established that that doesn't count.
Exactly. So
It's very similar.
Actually, yeah, it's very similar.
yeah.
In fact, oh my God, the Bible may be one of our first attempts to build continuity.
No, absolutely. There were
No,
continuity
it
errors
actually
in the New
is.
My
Testament.
brain just.
It
oh
actually
my God,
is.
It's the same thing.
I mean, pretty much that, and then the canon of Arthurian legend
yeah.
would be the two, I guess.
I-
The history of Britannia.
Being named Taliesin, I've never read any of that.
Did I help?
So,
Yeah.
60s,
1986. What
Marvel. Well, Marvel happened.
Okay.
Marvel didn't have little disjointed bits. They just they built a little racing pod of a continuity because they they had little issues, but like
They
their
unfroze
continuity-
Captain America after 16 years away
They
or
did.
whatever.
But
They
he
have, but
wasn't-
they do the thing that DC doesn't, where Marvel has the roving timeline, where like
Yeah.
every 20 years we just sort of move everything up a little bit.
But that again
Yeah.
hadn't been established yet.
That's
they're
true.
like-
That's
No,
very
but
true.
they were a tighter, faster machine, and they made DC nervous.
They were kind of coming from behind and therefore with more freedom.
Oh, yeah.
Most of their big hits in the early 60s, the Silver Age, so the Silver Age is considered to start with Flash, with Showcase Comics number 4.
Bless you.
Which was remember this sort of anthology idea. We're just trying stuff. They're like, what about a new superhero? Maybe people will be into that again. So that's considered the start of the Silver Age, but it really gets into swing in the early 60s with Marvel, and this is the point where, as you may have noticed from previous shows, we get the Fantastic Four out of nowhere, we get the X-Men out of nowhere, we get Spider-Man out of nowhere. They assemble the Avengers, mostly with some of these new hit characters, but then they
That
start...
weren't
they
doing
also,
as well in their own comics.
Yeah.
Yeah, they start mining their own past as well. They're like,
because Marvel didn't just get born as Marvel. It comes from Timely.
Atlas, which came from Timely, they had a couple
So they
different
have a
names.
similar
Timely,
sort of
Atlas,
zeitgeist. They just hit their stride a little bit later.
And they
But
were
a lot
Stan
of those,
Lee-
like Captain America, they had actually stopped publishing. Like
Yes.
where DC
Yeah.
kept the Trinity going even when they weren't selling very well in the kind of low years for superhero comics, a lot of the Marvel stuff had just folded.
Yeah.
But when they had their big resurgence, they were like, oh, start shopping around and all that stuff and bring it in.
When science was cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, so like with as far as I understand the history of Marvel, like after they stopped doing like Captain America comics, where Captain America basically just disappeared as a school teacher or something like that, like for the next 25 years or so, they're doing like horror stories, romance stories,
Yes.
cowboy stories, war stories, and the whole time that's going on, it's Kirby, Ditko, and Lee doing all of that. Stan Lee wants to go do his great American novel. His wife is like, give it one more shot. Just do the book that you've always wanted to do. And he's like, fine, you're right. I'm going to go do the Fantastic Four. And
Stanley, actually.
yeah, thank you. And he goes and creates the Fantastic Four as kind of I miss doing superheroes. That's where I started. Screw it, here it is. And all the kids in the 60s were like, my God.
Yeah.
Like, because what Stan Lee did that was different, and this is
Well, they
Silver
learned
Age
their
stuff.
lessons.
Wonderful arguments about the relative merits of the Silver Age of both companies. I enjoy these arguments because both of them were doing amazing, classic,
Yeah.
legendary stuff, and
Yeah.
so there's no loser in the
And
like,
really
who's
There
the
really
more
isn't.
interesting stuff?
Like Silver Age stuff is wonderful because
was-
like they're still playing and experimenting, and like you can see like like if you read it from a more studious perspective, you can see where they're coming up with some of this
Yep.
new stuff and playing and
Competitive
experimenting.
creativity. There's
Yeah.
no
Yes.
loser.
But like one of the things that Fantastic
Well
Four
said.
did that, as far as I know, DC had not done was say, well, let's make very normal people superheroes now, and let's see them struggle with that. Let's see a
Marvel pushed
teenager.
the envelope in terms of like sort of an approach to writing, which was they were sort of out in front in terms of like giving them personal troubles. So the idea of
Yes.
Spider-Man is just
Yeah.
an ordinary kid who's got to pay bills. That was a
Yeah,
bit
who's
And help
Spider-Man's
his-
greatest
his
enemy?
Ant-Man.
Poverty.
Yeah,
Yeah.
really.
and tragedy.
Yeah.
I guess that was tragedy was well established.
And responsibility.
The DC heroes are often referred to as a pantheon because they are not human.
They're
then
god archetypes.
I mean, like,
whereas-
where, like even their human characters are
Yes, but Marvel,
Especially
like
in the 60s,
like I
yeah.
mentioned science because a lot of
Well.
Marvel characters are based out of like they're scientists, and DC characters are too. But that is a real crux of the same creative zeitgeist that something like Star Trek came out of. Like, we're gonna go to the stars, we're gonna create all these things, we're gonna fix humanity because we kind of screwed it up at the beginning of the century.
Yeah, very much so.
Do over.
Yeah.
So like that's kind of like that's why like we're talking about DC, but in terms of Marvel having like maybe a different continuity or maybe a stronger sense of continuity, it's because they started in the midst of what DC had discovered,
And they only
were
had
able
like
to stand
six
on the
guys
shoulder of that
at the
that
same
also.
time, whereas DC was just a much larger company, and it's hard with more moving parts.
Yes.
Yeah, but like Marvel was very much able to stand on the shoulder of the giant and say, continuity is a big thing. This is awesome. Let's create the Avengers because the Hulk and Ant-Man aren't selling very well. Let's put them in a team.
The big guy and the small
This
guy.
was there were two interesting things that happened in Crisis that I still want to point out, which was there was a audience avatar character, like the character that has the audience perspective on
When
everything.
he says Crisis, he means the 1986
The
story.
86 Crisis of Infinite Earth.
If
the first
it's not
one.
specified, Crisis usually means that one.
That one. The best one.
Yes.
Well, you know, we can
The
we
most
can debate.
pivotal,
Most
certainly with the
pivotal.
biggest effect on
Still good
comics.
read. One of the things, there was a character literally called, who was kind of the audience character, called the Psycho Pirate,
Currently appearing in Batman Rebirth.
which was basically kind of a manifestation of the audience's inability to deal anymore. He mostly sat in a corner and cried a lot, much like the audience. It was kind of his deal. His superpower was he was the only one who actually knew what was going on, and it was more than he could handle. It's so sad. The Psycho Pirate is so sad. He had the worst. He basically had like the man
He had the
Harley
worst
Quinn.
costume
It was like
of
a Harley.
all
It was like an attempt at the Harley Quinn costume
weird-
It was like Master Jailer, but even worse.
with like a happy face and a sad face. And then they killed Barry Allen.
Yeah.
That
And
was,
it's the greatest thing Barry Allen ever did for comics. And I don't mean that to be facetious.
Psycho
I
Pirate.
don't mean that to be rude, but like that is the most important thing Barry Allen has ever done.
No, it was.
It's died.
He began and ended the Silver Age of comics.
Yeah.
And that was.
And
Technically,
I make
it's considered the Bronze Age comes in
Well,
between,
yes.
but like what Taliesin is saying applies in a,
And
a
I make the
sense.
same argument. Supergirl also, Kar-Zor-El
Also.
dies in this, and it's
That's that classic.
one of the most
Yeah.
pivotal images of that era.
probably the most important thing that she's done in
Oh.
terms of the overall continuity and
Let-
what she's contributed to it. And when you're a smaller character like that, you don't get to change the world that often.
No.
Let me ask you, why do you say that? Why are all three of you saying, why does Barry Allen's death completely change? Like, why is that the best thing he did for comics?
I think
I don't disagree with you. I just want to
Yeah,
know.
yeah.
Like, I'm an
I mean,
idiot,
I'll definitely
so-
give you starting the Silver Age, but that's a meta thing that
Def-
he happens to be a part of. Like, this is something he does in continuity. It's a sacrifice on the level of the Trinity that these lower tier characters don't usually get to do. It changes the world, and because Barry Allen is kind of a boring sad sack. And I'm sorry,
Rosemary.
until the new 52 comes, when they give him Wally West's personality, Barry Allen is not a very interesting
No,
character.
he was a bow tie.
Yeah, and so that this sacrifice in his pantheon of stories is the most exciting thing he ever does. Now he's come back and he's done important things and he's had a big facelift and he's been more important since then. But I think if
But
you're
he's-
looking at his scope of history, you're like, okay, he was
What a-
created. We ran with Jay Garrick. He saved the world by dying, and then he screwed up the timeline and gave everyone more lines on their costumes. Like, that's kind of it.
Man,
And he stayed
man.
dead for a very long time by
Death
comic
was
Very
book
long
standards.
death was
Yeah.
real back then. Death
real
was
sort of.
death had there was a
Mostly.
consequence that it was going to possibly be a thing that lasted.
Yes.
Whereas this was before we officially broke death.
For the record, the death in comics as an idea of like a thing that might really happen and affect things on an ongoing basis is considered to mark the start of the Bronze Age, and that's usually pegged to Amazing Spider-Man and the death of Gwen Stacy.
Stacy.
Oh.
That was in the early 70s. So the Silver Age is 60s, and then sometime in the early to mid 70s, you transition into Bronze, and you get some of these like, this is where like the Bronze into the 80s is a lot of this like continuity is getting really intense, and you get both the gifts of it, like a death that everyone who was reading comics will remember for the rest of their lives. I was
Yeah.
not around
And
reading
you
comics
get,
at
you
that
get a
point, but
lot
I've
more
heard.
darker storytelling as
You
well.
do. Like Aquaman loses a child.
Yeah.
That was a like I think happened before Gwen Stacy made, but those were two of the early big ones that were sort of like
Spider-Man
this
had a
idea
few.
of long-term
Well,
consequences. But
Spider-Man
then
had a lot of good
Harry
stuff.
Osborn's drug problem.
Yeah, like-
Speedy's. Oh, was that
Speedy's
the
drug
Yeah.
problem, yeah.
they're
No,
they're
telegraph
experimenting
development.
with darker storytelling and already getting into some of this conflict of like now they're starting, by the time Barry Allen sacrifices himself, he's had a whole, like, murder trial. Things have gotten weird and dark. And that was part of what Crisis was sort of trying to fix. Let's clean that up.
Tune ease on. Which Crisis are we talking about?
Infinite Earths.
Yes.
We're still in Infinite Earths. We haven't gotten past the
Infinite
end of the
Earths.
90s yet.
Yeah, like one of the things that I find so interesting about the death of Gwen Stacy is like it's the onomatopoeia that kills her. Like it's crack. That's it. That's it.
Yeah, that's
and
it.
that really is
God,
very much like
right
just that one frame. It's just her and you see
Referring
crack
to a
right off
specific
the neck.
panel
Yeah.
of
Gotta reach here for
this
that
very
one if you
famous-
love that. Every big blow that is struck is a black panel with letters on it.
Really?
Yeah, it's amazing.
Nice.
Yeah.
But yeah, like very much like, and like I do feel like the Bronze Age kind of like people are starting to take comics more seriously. Like it's, and I think that maybe that comes partially because they're rejecting the comic code because it's a couple years after the Jerry Conway thing that Stan Lee publishes that one comic without the stamp of the comics
we're
code.
definitely
They start
ramping
kind of
up.
Well, also the 80s
Exactly.
are happening.
Yeah.
And that's important. Like,
Well,
for
but, like,
anybody who
even-
lived through the 80s.
Frank Miller.
this is
But
this
the
is all
weird
still
thing
late
is, like, he
'70s.
did such good shit before he
When like
No, for sure.
is it not like
It's late 70s. I mean, like, it's all happening at one. I mean, like, there's
it's all happening? Well, that's what I'm
there's
saying.
no
It's all
time
happening.
line.
Bronze is
lines,
early
but-
70s to sort of it's debated at what point we go to the next age and what we call the next age because modern and dark are both proposed for the following year. And it happens sometime in the
And it's always and due to chronology, it's always debatable when you shift from a light gray to a dark gray.
Yeah.
Like there's never going to be very rarely do we get that goalpost in the sand, and when we do, it has been a long time coming.
Yeah.
There are things that we can point to as definite signs, but that you never really know where you are on the road until you've even.
A lot of people
after
like to
passed
hold
it.
up the creation of Image Comics for like that shift as well.
That was an interesting like even like the dark had well we're about to
No,
get to
Sometimes
that.
they call it the chromium age because they're making a joke about the variant covers that are shiny.
But they're
and
not
it's silly.
wrong.
They're not wrong.
Whereas some people like to say that the next big era is the rise of the black and white independents in the 80s, which sort of establish a new wing of comics and come out of like this maturing marketplace. They grew up on the silver and then the Bronze Age stories where they're really starting to try to take things seriously, sometimes for better and sometimes for worse. Created a set of readers which were willing to sort of take chances on other material, which we've talked about before. The idea of the comic book store came around in the late 70s, and it was in some ways the loss of this broader audience, but the acquisition of a place that could support more experimental storytelling. So anyway, that'll reverberate through comics for the next couple
Well,
decades.
it takes less than a decade that they need to clean it up again.
So yeah, Crisis on Infinite Earths established one continuity. They put a bunch of massive superstars on their titles. John Byrne takes over the Superman books.
They're
they
awesome.
Are wildly successful. But
The
they're
Bat
all,
Family's never been better.
No, it's amazing.
George Perez starts drawing and eventually writing Wonder Woman.
New Teen Titans transitions into becoming the Titans for the first time, which is
very
really
fun.
exciting.
But almost immediately, the cracks start to show. Because you start to get things that like they decided didn't exist anymore that they kind of want to exist again, or questions like if the nature of the Superboy story had changed, can you still have a thing where he went and joined a future super team called the Legion of Superheroes?
Connor.
So it all falls less than a decade and it all falls apart again.
And so at this point we are now talking post-crisis.
Post-crisis.
This is,
Crisis.
and by crisis we mean Crisis on Infinite Earths, the storyline that takes place in
Otherwise
1986.
specified.
Which
Unless
have
other
we
business.
said that it was by Marv Wolfman and George Perez?
No, but it is a brilliant. I mean, I
You
think
don't
it's still
know
a good
who
read.
they are. You
It's
should
a
go
very
and
good
read
read.
it now.
It's dense. It is a dense
is.
read.
It's dense and it's older comics, which is kind of like reading Shakespeare if you're used to modern comics.
Yeah.
It's like reading Days of Future Past for a Marvel equivalent.
Yeah.
It's liner notes to Game of Thrones. It's like the Game of Thrones prequel novellas. You're just like there's so many names and you're pretty sure they mean something and it's dense.
But
Yeah.
those guys were two of the absolute top talents of they're legendary comic book
Their
creators.
New Teen Titans outsold everything else for the better part of a
Yeah.
decade.
There was
so.
the early part of the 80s. We talk about how they were struggling under the weight of continuity, but they were also incredibly creative, productive times because there was this arms race between the X-Men book
Yeah.
and
Oh, they were
New
both
Teen
so
Titans.
good.
And
They
like
were both.
basically those people were just sort of dying to get the next piece of those, and they were heavily serialized. Continuity mattered a lot, and the stakes were very high, and they were wonderful stories. But yeah, then we get to 1986, and they
Well, and then
And it was around this exact same year that was Secret Wars 85 or 86? Because Marvel did something very similar, but they just didn't. They didn't have
Secret
to.
Wars just didn't reboot.
It just didn't
Secret
reboot
Wars
anything.
was
But
an
that was
event
like.
without a reboot.
But that was a giant event, and it was like
another
that
giant
kind of
landmark
Yeah.
event. Yeah, the idea
Like,
of putting all
that's-
your heroes in one place.
But that was the first time
And the black
Marvel,
suit.
like, yeah,
The
like,
black Spider-Man suit.
yeah, well, and the black. There wasn't a symbiote suit
No.
exactly.
In Marvel's
yet.
case,
and it was
rather
created
than,
by an
like-
imagination machine, basically.
In Marvel's case, rather than breaking the universe and creating a new version of events, Secret Wars was the first example of them taking, let's take like all our big hitters from everything we can think of and basically pull them out of their stories and send them on an adventure together.
And do we know why
did
they
have
did that?
long-term consequences.
Toy line.
Toys.
Toys.
Yep.
They
Yep.
made a lot of toys. It was also a victory lap. Like it was a real
Yeah.
victory lap for Marvel, going like they're struggling to keep all their stuff together, and we're making toys. And it was very. I mean, you know, it was cocky for the time. It was brazen.
It's okay, they'd have to sell off all those properties
Oh,
to different
yeah.
film studios about a minute
And
later.
the chairs, those are decisions were made on.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, well said.
But meanwhile, post-Crisis, we also get one of the things which I think is a big part of like DC fandom is that like the new generation of fans that comes in right as a new thing is established. They bond to that version of events in a really beautiful way. So, for instance, there's a whole lot of people in the 25 years Barry Allen is dead.
25.
Like, I think it's about 25.
It's a long time.
It's a long
It's very
time.
important
And
to like
I'm one of these
contextualize
kids.
this.
Well, it's,
a lot of
it's
people, if you
86 to 2011.
Yeah.
So however many years that is.
just about, it's 25. It is.
Yeah.
Oh, no.
96, 06, 11.
25 years. This character
So,
stayed a memory.
In
a
the
beautiful
meantime,
memory.
if you joined the DC universe at that point, you got very invested in new versions of the characters. You got Wally West was the Flash. He was trying to live up to the legacy of the
And
Kyle Rayner.
And Kyle.
Yes,
Oh, we're
the
gonna get
Kyle
to Kyle.
Kyle's got his Green Lantern costume and crap mask back.
I love that mask so much.
It's so
It's so ridiculous.
And this is
But-
where DC's kind of inventing the concept. They already had legacy characters, but a lot of it is really cemented by the storytelling. A legacy character is someone basically taking on the mantle of a different hero.
Well, this is Nightwing's first solo series. This is Robin's first solo
Solo
series.
series.
This is Batgirl's first solo
And this
series.
is all post-crisis.
Post-crisis.
Yes, this
Okay.
is all
And-
early 90s, mostly written by Chuck Dixon.
Bless. Two big things are important about this. The two big things that are important about this is kind of the first time where a comic book company, and DC does this first, acknowledges that the suit is bigger than the person inside of it,
Yeah.
and starts realizing that they can actually create several people who are Robin, and several people who are Flash, and several Green Lanterns, and it's not just a hard reboot of literally.
They could have taken a step back on the Green Lanterns.
Well, we'll get there. We'll get there. I have a note. And the other thing that happens, and they more or less have come out and said this, is that they realized they wanted Marvel characters. They're like, DC Comics is DC characters. We want some Marvel characters. We want flawed, kind of identifiable.
I love the phrase that said Marvel characters from the 60s, they had feet of clay. That was the, like...
So,
And I think that's another reason that a lot of the characters that come out of sort of like 89 onward are so beloved, and so many people love these versions better. And that's definitely like a bubble of who I talk to.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
But it's because they are more real people than even someone like Bruce Wayne or Clark Kent.
Which
one of the-
obviously,
yeah.
like, Mark Wolfman had been working towards on the new
Of
Teen
course,
Titans.
yeah.
And,
One
like,
of
there's
the-
always... Every era has great work being done in it.
One of the things I've heard, like in comparison of like DC to Marvel, neither one is right or wrong. It's just like the comparison of it is that DC comics are gods trying to be humans, and Marvel comics are humans all of a sudden discovering that they have godlike powers.
it's very blanket, but it's true.
Yeah, it's
And-
very
Both
generalized.
are going on at both,
this
but-
generation
yeah.
of superheroes that came out of, and there was also another reboot in the middle of this called 0 Hour.
Hal Jordan destroyed Coast City because he came back and went crazy.
After Superman died, a whole bunch of
Yeah.
we'll get
So,
to Grimdark, but
this was the thing that ties into when we did our Image episode and
Yes.
the documentary that Taliesin was in and recommended to us, which
That's a
is
great documentary.
fantastic. One of the things I remember from that documentary is that there's this sort of throwaway moment where is it Liefeld or McFarlane in that documentary who says sort of like, "Oh, Batman's back getting broken? We did that."
well, I
because
think that
essentially-
sounds very Liefeld.
They sort of take credit for what happened in the 90s.
Did Batman have feet?
Which is sort of they had gone independent, and they were doing these sort of more extreme stories, and the big companies in some ways rushed to catch up. We've skipped Watchmen.
And we're about to. Yeah,
Okay.
you're leading well into Watchmen.
Yeah.
By the way, the joke that Weed is high-fived on is because Liefeld cannot draw feet.
And he,
Everyone stands in smoke. It's so
we try
great.
and be cool about it, but yeah, he can't.
He can't draw feet, but he loves pouches.
He
So-
does, and look, and some of my favorite
has
characters
some
have many
trademarks.
Liefeld-inspired pouches. And we shade, but he's a great artist who changed a lot of comics. So.
Yeah,
He's had a profound effect.
Yeah, and yeah, he's Liefeld's Liefeld, bless him. So.
Liefeld's gonna like
Bless him.
Yeah,
Yeah, Liefeld got a Liefeld.
that'd be a great T-shirt.
That
I think he
actually-
would
that may
probably
be our
wear
first
that
t-shirt.
T-shirt.
I agree.
Oh, so you would wear that T-shirt with
I'll-
his
to the next
face
Deadpool
on it?
premiere.
Yeah.
We'll see if he's down Liefeld.
He's
Liefeld
very
gonna like
nice,
him.
for the record.
He is
He
so
is-
sweet.
Oh, he's so nice.
He's so sweet.
All the image founders are really nice dudes.
Yeah,
Like they're all lovely.
I have not met very many.
I've met a few of them. They've all been really cool to me.
Hey, so what's Watchmen? What happened there?
So Alan Moore,
Remember the Charlton characters we talked about?
yeah. So yeah, Alan Moore, who is he was becoming a big name and starting to do a lot of stuff. You'll read
Which we
about
talked
Alan
about
Moore.
on our-
Wizard.
He's the angry uncle, angry
Great
Saruman
bearded
on the
wizard of
tower of
Northampton.
DC Comics. Of Northampton.
He's the man who was born a beard and then grew into a beard.
Grew into a beard. There was just a beard.
Grew
and
into a
slowly
man.
grew.
We talked a bit about how he came to DC in our horror episode.
Yes.
Yes.
Which is how he got recruited to work on the Swamp Thing book, and then sort of like started taking
There
on
we
all
go.
these jobs around the DC universe. But he had big ideas, and he really wanted to push comics in a direction of being more awesome.
So the Charlton characters, DC had all these Charlton characters they hadn't done anything with in a while. All these characters who have been owned by another company, and like Blue Beetle and the Question, who are my two favorites of that group. So the Phantom Lady. I think.
Captain Adam.
Captain Adam,
Phantom
a
Lady.
bunch
Phantom
of
Lady's
them.
the first female comic book.
Yeah, and quite a. I mean, like.
Was it Phantoma or?
Well, maybe it was
Wasn't
Phantom.
it like Nirvana of the Northern Lights?
Technically,
Okay.
but
I
the
should
first
say- you should,
American.
We may have to. That may
Okay.
be an episode. So he wanted to kind of do because he was really into this like notion of deconstruction, which was kind of a new idea of like actually like looking at how these stories about superheroes functioned and kind of pulling apart why. I mean, like.
It's very proto Grant Morrison.
Yeah, oh, very. I mean, like Grant. I mean, this is how we got Grant Morrison was by someone going, "Let's deconstruct these stories, see how they function, see why they don't work in real life."
What are the basic ideas? What would really happen? What are the sort of symbolic like
Why do we?
implications
But
of
also,
the structure?
all of it is in continuity, and none of it is silly. It's treating everything, even as you deconstruct it,
Yeah,
with a level of respect that you didn't see necessarily across the
He
board.
he made a little bubble to start playing with these characters and to be like, I'm going to do this story and it's not going to affect it because you can't because like the whole point of the story is these characters have to be in a vacuum bag because the minute you let them out into the air, they're going to get sick and die. They are not designed to live in our real world. They require a blanket and very soft morality where, like, literally, as Morrison once put, we can have a debate on vegetarianism where I just literally make a character who kills animals for pleasure and then have Animalman beat him up, and that's the moral argument. And he's like, I know that sounds weird. That's kind of what we do in real life anyway, but let's keep it there. And they're like, they start to read it and they're like, this is great. This is so great that we don't want to use.
So Alan Moore has pitched a version of a story that would use these existing superhero characters since he was trying to sort of make a commentary on the history of the genre and of comic books and of superhero storytelling. He initially pitched it as like, I can use these characters you're not really doing anything with.
Mm-hmm.
And then DC started to see what he was doing and going like, we want these characters now, so why don't you just come up with new different names for these, like make
your own version.
Make your own
Analogs,
versions.
yeah.
Ersatz it.
So Question becomes Rorschach, and Beetle becomes Owlman, and Captain Atom becomes Dr. Manhattan, and
He's
naked.
Phantom Lady becomes Silk
he's
Spectre.
Mecha.
Your face. He's naked.
And
like super naked, though.
Supremely
or as we
naked.
like to call him, Big Papa Smurf.
Yeah. He was the first naked person I ever saw in a comic book, so
Yeah.
it's very
Yeah,
stuck
very
with
much,
me.
very much.
That creates all sort of unusual expectations about life later.
That was probably a
Uh,
weird thing to awe. but-
Yeah, no, but it's, I mean, like,
Now I own all of Sunstone.
so he does this, and it's a very dark, I mean, like, it's a brilliant read.
Yeah, so side note, for like you can have infinite. We should probably do an entire episode on Watchmen at some point.
And
But
the,
it's-
and the
big of a
9-panel
deal.
grid.
It's a big enough a deal that like literally
kidding, I
I've
was
gone to
kidding.
Burning Man and brought a copy and read it while there. Even
Yeah.
though that,
I
like,
once
that's
lived in
just
an apartment where there were 4 of us, and we all owned our own copy of Watchmen. And
As
one of us
you
didn't
should.
like.
I
One of
own
my
3.
roommates didn't even read comics, but he had Watchmen,
Yeah.
like because it was
So
It is one of the few that, even if you're not a comics person, people have read or heard of.
because it is also one of the greatest novels ever
I've
written.
I've
for my
seen
money.
it on like top 50, top 100 novels of all time lists, like stuff like that, where it's like, oh, it's actually a comic book.
it
and it's on
came
that
out
list.
as
yeah.
comics. It
I
came
mean,
out
there's
in
enough
12
words to be
issues.
Yeah, very
But it
true.
was designed to be a standalone story told in 12 issues that would be collected into one. Like, you can read this front to back. This is the entire story, beginning, middle, end. I've created it. It is done just like a novel. Like, you start reading it and then you finish. Even if Dickens published it in chapters at first, it was a novel.
And Watchmen was one of the I might be wrong. It was the first book that I ever saw where they had like other literature. Like they had like
yeah.
newspaper articles from
Yes.
that
Alan
world,
Moore was
and they had
experimenting with the forms, so he was like,
which
well, I'm doing...
that made me immediately fall in love.
Interesting
I was like,
panel
no
structure.
matter what the story is, I love that he has like other literature. He has like
There's the
articles
whole,
that were
the
written.
whole
comic in
fictional
the comic?
novel.
Yeah, he's got like the pirate,
There's a
that
comic
pirate
within the
comic
comic,
that's
yeah.
really big.
Who's writing that novel
Tales of Black.
in the
Yeah.
book? I'm trying to remember who's.
It's been
I
a
don't- I know
long
it's been so long.
time since I read one.
Anyway, so he's
Like a
experimenting with
decade.
a form. Boom 2215 says Watchmen brought about the Dark Age.
Well, what
So,
happened?
on what
unintended
you're gonna-
consequences!
DC. This is the line that DC is currently taking. Some other people may. I will say that was maybe 0.0. That might have been when the bomb hit, but like where everything got
This
weird.
is
Yeah.
this is a point for me where like Watchmen did something. Like there were a number of comics in the 80s that can be said to have pushed the sophistication of comics in different ways, but Watchmen is
Daredevil, Frank Miller's Daredevil is a
Frank
big one
Miller's
as well.
Daredevil.
there's
Yeah.
a lot like Frank Miller's Ronin was considered like to advance the art form in really significant ways. Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns does a lot to change the art
Yeah.
form in significant ways. But Watchmen was sort of sophisticated on a level that took everyone by surprise. And like I think Mouse was already being written by this point.
Sure.
So you have. But like in the superhero world and published with the DC name on it, even though it wasn't DC Universe, like Watchmen changed everybody's ideas about what was possible. And this is going to be really sad, but I have to take a side note. There's a friend of mine at the shop who was like a big 80s guy, reader, and he views this as his ultimate heartbreak. He read Watchmen at the time, and he knew it would change comics. But he looks at the history since then, and he says everyone learned the wrong lesson.
It's so true. That is it. Everyone
The future
looked at
he
it.
thought would emerge from it, and like I sort of counter him where I'm like, I think that future is emerging. Like has like the idea of like we wouldn't have. I mean, Fun Home doesn't necessarily owe an immediate debt to Watchmen, but like this. In terms of like it did pay off, my friend.
It
I
opened-
promise
okay,
it.
so
I mean,
wait.
Pandora's
also,
It's also tough to fault an industry for not doing the thing that you wanted or you hoped for, especially one that is built with so many moving cogs. You know, like any way that you might have predicted or hoped that this would have gone could have been kiboshed by a colorist, a letterer, an editor,
But it's-
finances.
It's the same fear. It's the reason we have a fear after Deadpool the movie did very very well.
Yeah.
Where we're like we all
don't learn the
we
wrong
enjoyed
lesson.
it, and we're hoping that what people who make movies, we're hoping the lesson you don't take away is what we want is more R-rated movies.
But it's
'Cause that's not
not
the
the people
lesson.
who make it; it's the
Yeah.
people who finance it.
yes. Okay, there's probably some
So
separation
let
to
me
do.
We
let me
may
back it
not
all
have
up.
mentioned Watchmen had violence and sexuality, which were not common in superhero comics.
Deep politics. Yeah.
A ton of sophisticated
Nixon was
political
still
thought.
president. Like, yeah.
It had these elements, and so the kind of wrong lesson idea is that like the thing that was cool about it was this level of violence and handling sophisticated stories about like sexual violence and other stuff. Like that's sort of the people went, that's cool. I'm gonna do that, and a lot of times that was a bad.
Yeah,
idea.
it was the notion of deconstruction of like what we want to see now that we've been living with these characters for 50 years is I want to see Batman taken apart into his base pieces. I want to like this is really cool. Let's break everything to see how the parts work. And the problem with that is you've broken everything now.
Which is one reason why, like, Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns was incredibly notable in this genre. There had been, like, interesting, darker takes on Batman, but this one sort of changed everybody's
So,
ideas
let me-
about
It was
what
also
he
out
could
of
do.
continuity still though.
Yeah.
But it was the
It was
future.
in
It
its
wasn't
soul.
like we have to live with this Batman forever.
Yeah.
the most 80s feature of all time.
Yes.
You guys are
Thank you, Matt.
so
Please
filled with
help us.
knowledge.
Oh, there's so
And
much.
I,
That's
and
the problem.
No. And I love The Watchmen. I've read The Watchmen. Like, I can throw in on that, but I'm playing the audience
No,
today.
yeah,
so
please.
let me. What lesson should they have learned?
You can be smart.
Because like we're all saying they learned the wrong lesson.
The lesson they should
what
have
lesson
learned.
should they have
the
learned?
lesson they should have learned is get smarter. Is make mature mean smarter, not more exploitive.
So basically, what you're saying is
Mature doesn't mean violence and pornography, which is sometimes the way it was.
Mature is like here's the notion. Blade Runner is mature. Saw, the movie is not. Like those are two different forms of mature. We wanted Blade Runner, we got Saw.
So what you're saying is we wanted sophisticated storytelling that tackled complicated themes that used deconstruction in a way where we were able to examine various moral implications
Or
and
understanding that
complications of the
deconstruction
character.
wasn't possible in the main continuity.
Or that once you've deconstructed it, you can't
break
go
it.
back.
Yeah, that's the trouble with deconstruction is that
So
you break.
let me throw this out there. Watchmen came before Miller's Dark Knight and Year One.
I'm not sure. Although
I think they're roughly contemporary with
Year
each
They're
one
other.
was
all
not a
kind of
deconstruction.
around the same time. No, your was just
it was all the zeitgeist was happening. Watchmen is usually the one that's given the most credit because where Miller was deconstructing Batman,
but
Moore was deconstructing comics.
That's what I'm trying to get at is that if Miller follows Watchmen, then that is DC saying, "Oh, that was awesome. We should do that with our mainline continuity." And therein, while Dark Knight Returns
Marvel
is
too.
incredible,
They're happening at the
No.
same
But
time.
there's hits
Okay.
and misses in there because you get something like the reign of the Supermen when after John Byrne, spoiler alert, kills Superman. You get these four.
Now we get the spoiler alerts.
I know. You get these four representations of like what Superman is and his functionality in the world and the pros and cons of that, and like that's an amazing arc.
That's
it's a
interesting.
well executed story, and then eventually they just bring Clark Kent back to life, and that's what puts it back in the box and you build a character up again. And then toward the end of the 90s, when you get towards some Batman stuff like No Man's Land, you get Super Dick Batman, who's telling Dick Grayson to go screw himself and punches him in the face.
As opposed
That's
to
actually
Super Dick
Bruce
Batman,
Wayne,
which is a
murderer.
completely different.
Yeah,
different character.
and that can be something that for some people, and there's some people who love
Everybody
all of
loves
this really
something.
dark stuff, but there's some people who view that as going too far, and you can trace the origins of like that version of Bruce Wayne all the way back to what came immediately out of Watchmen.
So Dark Knight Returns was slightly ahead.
Okay,
They
but
were,
like-
they were basically coming out at the same time. They're both 1986.
Like
I thought that's what was
a good
going on
version
there.
of this Marvel deconstruction though would be Spider-Man and Craven, of like
Craven's Last Hunt.
Craven's Last Hunt of like Spider-Man stories are interesting, but what if we ruin Spider-Man, put him in a casket and bury him,
Actually
and
kill
make
him in some
and
way.
make him climb and literally make him scrape his way out of his own grave.
It's dark.
Is that like that's an interesting story? I don't know if that's a Spider-Man story necessarily.
It didn't feel like it never
It
felt like
actually
a Spider-Man
wasn't a
story.
Spider-Man story. It was planned for a different DC book, and they just used it.
Wait,
instead.
seriously? What's this?
I don't remember
Oh,
that
that's
either.
That
beautiful.
does happen a lot
Right
with,
here.
with characters and within different companies as well, because there's only like 80 people in the entire industry.
And that was DeMatteis,
and Alan
right?
Moore.
I
Who
believe it
wrote
was.
Craven's Last
And
Hunt?
Alan Moore is a very thoughtful writer, and like a lot of the writers, while they were good at what they did, were not necessarily thoughtful. And so you get a lot of people now just trying to one-up each other. Instead of one-up each other in one direction, they're trying to basically see who can race to like the comic book adaptation of I Spit on Your Grave faster.
Yeah.
And it becomes kind of a gore fest and a Marilyn Manson-esque shock fest where it's just like, I can break Batman's spine and put him in a wheelchair, or I can kill, I mean, like, not that this was itself a deconstruction, I can murder Animal Man's wife and small children and make him find it and then freak out and start murdering people. I can
So,
make
are
Green
we-
Lantern kill a city full of people.
Are we getting to Identity Crisis yet?
Well, we're getting
Oh,
Zero
we're not
Hour,
there
and then,
yet.
well, here's
Not
the thing,
quite there
we're
yet.
not even, and then, like, that's the thing, that's not even a reboot. We have, and because they keep
it's
trying
just
to...
an event, yeah.
They keep breaking the toys and trying to shove them back together and shove them back in the box. The boxes start to degrade. I'm trying. My metaphors a little.
I like
But
it.
you're also it might be a box from the Silver Age and they don't fit,
And they don't fit anymore. And like
and
you
they don't
can't.
have to.
Because
But you should
audiences
build a
have
new
changed a
box.
little bit. We've had some stories kind of challenge what we want. Like this is like currently like my argument with like what Marvel Studios is doing versus what Fox proved that you can do with Logan. It's like, well, that's
We're
Logan was
hoping
good,
that Logan
you know.
gets
So like
6 sequels now, though.
I'm not. I want
I
Logan
mean,
to stand alone.
if
But
they-
like, I'm trying to make the
Those
metaphor.
kids,
You know,
I'm into it.
No, but like this is the thing: is does more Logan make it better?
and that's the argument that I'm saying.
Again, from
is
the
like,
people who
from the people-
finance these things,
It does. Yes. The answer is yes from a money standpoint.
I think that's why like Sony is doing Venom and all that. I think
I
Sony's
agree,
like,
yeah.
ooh, rated R. Let's
and
do it.
yeah,
let's
they just
do it,
came
let's
out
do
like
it.
Venom's rated R. Like, yeah, duh.
Of course.
Yeah, of course it
We've
is.
got
So-
multiple struggles. I don't want to.
So the box. No, we won't. We're not. But like the box keeps breaking. No, that's a whole. I don't even want to get into it. The box keeps breaking, and so they keep rebooting. Our reboots for building a new box to hold these characters because they keep making things that are like you can't break Batman's back or kill Superman's family and then forget it anymore. It's now part of the character, so you can't. Part of the point of these boxes is that once you're done with a character, you kind of put them back more or less as you found them. Is how a superhero works. And you can't
If you want to keep telling stories with them forever, eventually they either just become a PTSD nightmare, or you try to pretend some of that stuff didn't
Or
happen.
you have to work
literally
on the roving
mind-wipe them.
timeline and be like, I guess Nightfall didn't happen.
So 1994, Zero Hour. 2006, Infinite Crisis.
Superboy
2007,
Prime punches a hole in the universe.
Superboy Prime punches a hole in
and
the universe.
And resets the universe.
We used to make fun of that all the time.
It's classic. In a silly
Superboy
way.
Prime, the Superboy from our universe, goes crazy and punches a hole in the universe. Yeah.
So if
And
the idea of these, returning to the idea of a crisis, is like other versions of reality, it was sort of inevitable that someone is going to be like, let's get our reality involved.
Yeah,
And-
exactly.
We
So-
complimented this when we were talking about Wasteland, because these, again, all of the bad ideas are good ideas that are just out of control.
So let me,
I like that.
So
I like that a
let
lot.
me let me slow us down.
Some of them are bad ideas, but mostly good ideas.
So what started this trying to remold the box? Zero Hour
Well,
with
Zero,
DC. So we have Infinite Crisis. What's the next big reset?
Zero
You mean
Hour.
Crisis on Infinite Earths?
Yeah, so we have Crisis on Infinite Earths. The
Then-
next major reset is
94
Zero Hour.
Hour.
And that's where Green Lantern destroys Central
That's-
Coast City.
It
Yes.
also has Legion effects, right?
It has a whole.
I don't
Yeah.
know my Zero
Don't
Hour.
worry.
It's-
So,
Okay.
It's not great.
so from there, we get to where?
2006 Infinite Crisis. Again, like it's not even really important what happens. It's just we've lost our core concept of who we are.
So we're going.
So
So
we're
we're
back to
shrinking it
basics.
back.
Shrinking it back,
And
then
part of
Not
the
even
deal with
particularly
these
good at
making them stories is that like because DC was so successful with Crisis on Infinite Earths and it left such a mark, they try to make a point out of like having these changes to the world happen for in-story reasons. Come up with a story
Yeah.
that explains why there used to be a bunch of different Earths and now there's only one.
And often there's a meta narrative in the story about why they think everything has gone wrong.
Yeah.
And it's currently happening in
Oh,
Rebirth.
Rebirth.
As well.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're reading Wonder Woman, that's probably the most obvious example.
Infinite Crisis, 2006 Thunk, and then 2011. This is where things go really wrong. Is they keep is
You're
they,
going right to New 52. You're not going to do Final Crisis.
yeah,
You can do whatever you want.
So
It's
there-
no, but
there was Infinite
know
Crisis.
I have
Zero Hour and
Final
Infinite
Crisis is not. It's technically not a reboot.
no, but it leads into
I know.
Flashpoint.
I'm aware. I love Final
They-
Crisis.
So do I, and
Right.
people like it better now than they did when it was coming out.
It's
That
better-
book
That's
is
true.
so
At the
good
time,
and
people
was
were
so
like,
ahead
I
of
don't
its
know.
time.
and now they're-
We're getting there.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna because we have so little time. I'm
But
kind
you
of
said-
gonna run.
You have twin things also. There are several concerns operating at once. One is the sort of the story economy. Does this all fit in a thing? One is the darkness level. Like, do we need to sort of roll back some of the crazy stuff that's happening?
you can
and
see
the third
happening.
is the business concern that we have now figured out. If we make a massive world-shattering event, we will sell 18 jillion comic books.
And it works.
And it works.
It works,
and
which is the
maybe
most
get some new
frustrating
readers.
thing.
And maybe
It
get some new
works.
readers. Sometimes yes, sometimes no.
Okay.
This leads to a crescendo where things are getting, and especially because these books, I mean, there's an operative level of DC Comics which sets it apart from Marvel, where it's whimsy and silliness is kind of the only it's in the DNA of this construction, and there's only so many like murder rampages you can send Big Bird on before it gets very
Says you.
Yeah.
no, I mean, like, it's fun as a notion, but if this was like a continuing stream of like Sesame Street, that Big Bird was on the run because he once killed a man who was back in his teens, I mean, there's only so long you can really pretend that that's not a problem.
So
And
you get stories like circa 2000, the
Yeah.
JLA Avengers crossover, which was a really, really fun story, but that crossed DC and Marvel together. And what I found interesting when I went, because I didn't read it at the time, I read it later, but what I found interesting about it is that at the time it was written, they were sort of regarding the universes as having different tones, and DC's was the happier.
Is that
Yes.
the one where they go to Marvel? The Marvel Earth is or the DC Earth is bigger
It's
because
bigger
they have more
'cause there's
fictional
cities.
cities.
Yeah,
I
I love
think
that.
so.
Yeah, no, that is. It
cool.
is. That's
Yeah.
amazing.
I never know if it's that or amalgam.
Like
It's all-
the DC heroes land in the Marvel universe and they immediately run into the Punisher and they're like, "What is
Whoa,
this
whoa,
world?
whoa.
Yeah,
Y'all
yeah,
are out of
yeah.
You talk to this guy."
Because like the Marvel universe has traditionally been a little bit darker, or at
In
least
some
viewed,
ways,
it viewed
but
as such.
the reason it was such a surprise to me reading it was that I had also imbibed all of these different heroes of DC, so I had heard about things like shortly after that JLA Avengers crossover, we have stories like Identity Crisis.
Yes.
Which
And then-
use Watchmen-esque ideas but put them in the regular
Puts them in the
DC
regular
universe.
DCU, which was it's a shame because it's a good book, but it was a disaster.
Effectively meant to be standalone because you bring in Brad Meltzer, who has written comics over time, but he's also much more well known as a crime novelist. So you're bringing him in and you're using the cloud of his name.
This is 2004. I
It is
believe.
it is
2004.
difficult sometimes to make a power move like that and then have it still smash into your continuity. But there are events that take place in that need to be in continuity. The death of Tune Rick's father, all the stuff with Sue Dibney.
But it's just a mess.
But
See, but
it's not
It's
as,
a can
as
of, you can't
successfully
ever
executed as
go
possible.
back from some of the stuff they established.
The whole notion is basically they find a way to compromise the moral integrity of every single character in the Justice League, where they basically find a way to say, like, all this time through like the last 20 years, the Justice League have actually been a bunch of fascist jerks. Who
There's
have
a
been
really cool
undermining.
Green Arrow and Deathstroke
Yeah.
fight though, which establishes
It's great.
their rivalry. So if you think
I
it's
did-
older than that, it's not.
But the problem is the book ended, and now the Justice League are a bunch of fascist jerks.
I think
depending on your perspective.
Sure, I think the ending
But
of it
yes.
is probably the biggest problem, maybe even more than some of the events that happened. Because if it had been tied up, if you put a better button on it, and I don't know how you would have done that, and I'm not blaming an editor, I'm not bringing Brad Meltzer for it, but like you could have tied it up in a way I think that was more positive.
My whole theory, there's a thing called an Elseworld, which is basically when you tell a story that's not part of the main story, it should have been it would have been an amazing Elseworld. We've been still talking about it.
It would have been a bit dark for my taste as
It
an
would have been a
Elseworld
bit darker
but
for
it
my
would
taste
have
too,
like
but,
made
like,
sense
oh my
because
God.
But having it in continuity, I think, was
So-
yeah.
But they had to kill Jim Hendrick's dad.
It was
so.
it was a big nuclear bomb that went off that just caused everything to get weirder. And then 2007 52 reboot, 2011 Flashpoint reboot, also 2011 New 52 reboot.
Yeah.
Now we're at 2017 with another reboot. They're just
2011 was a big one.
Yeah,
They stopped
twice.
this was like I'll never forget working at a shop during the
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
that is an
I
experience.
felt
And it
felt
was-
bad for comic book shops around
I
that
did
time.
too.
What was interesting is that you were living with the contradictions because there were folks that had been shopping there the entire time I'd worked there, that had been reading DC their entire lives, who didn't necessarily throw fits, but just like I watched their hearts break.
It was
the
heartbreaking.
idea in 2011 was that they rather like they sort of did it in a story way, but mostly what they did was stop publication of everything. Start with number ones for everything.
Batman and Green Lantern got to not really reboot.
Here's the thing: they had new number ones, but
Yes.
like they initially sort of said like, okay, we're kind of starting over. Maybe some of the old stuff happened, but a lot of it didn't because it was too much and it was out of hand again.
So they've only been Batman for 5 years.
For 5 years, but what they did was they gave a different level of creative freedom to different teams. So in some cases, it became very unclear which things still counted, which ones didn't. They changed their mind about whether the Titans had ever existed before. They
Yeah.
had to change the the text in one of their comics when they made a paperback out of
It's
it.
tough
It
because
was-
there was a ton of we had an amazing Aquaman run that came
There
out
were
of
some
this.
fantastic
there's some
One
gems.
of like
There's
two
some gems.
that's ever existed.
Yeah.
We still talk about
Jeff
like the Batman
Johns
run that
and
started there,
Scott Snyder.
the Batman run that started there, the Wonder Woman run that started there, the
yeah.
Aquaman run that started there. There's a raging debate over whether these stories could have been done without that. But here's the thing: while I watched people's hearts break, I also sold the heck out of it to people who
Yeah.
didn't know how to get into comics, who were confused, who didn't know how to start. Some of them are still shopping at
It
the
was
store.
effective. It did the same thing, regardless of what you think about the continuity of the stories. It did what it was supposed to do. It's the same thing that Rebirth did. I think Rebirth has come out better as
Way.
far as the sort of PR
Yeah.
of it all is.
Well,
but the
it
point was
seems
to
have been planned a bit better.
definitely. But the point was we had low sales. We want new sales. We want new readers. New 52.
So-
Yeah, Bard in the Yard says, but the New 52 gave new readers a place to start, which for me was greatly appreciated.
Yeah.
So.
It did. The interesting thing, I mean, like, there's good and bad to say that the few things I'll say that were really interesting about 52 is the things that it did. It was at the time I was working as an internet commenter. I was a
Working as an internet commenter?
That's what we're doing right here. Like, you go on
Nice.
the internet and you talk to a camera.
Yeah.
I was on several comic book shows at the time, and it was
I thought you
literally.
just meant leaving comments on message boards and
I
someone
do that
paid
too.
you. That's
Who has time? Oh well, and as I says, like, I just did that last night, didn't I?
Ha!
Never mind.
It's us.
Be
It's
nice
us.
in the comments.
Be nice in the comments, and the comments will be nice. No, the comments are always mean.
Oh,
no,
no,
here they're
you
nice.
guys are great.
We love you. You guys are great. You guys are like my little safe space. Is that we had to draw straws to say who would talk about DC because you couldn't, like, if you were a commentator who could actually talk passionately about the DC books at the time, you were in demand because no one could, and no one. It was like it shows that we're like, okay, who's going to take DC this week? I'm like,
It was
I'll
tough
read 'em.
because there was a sense of being afraid that they had sort of they let the gratuitous violence stuff, they let it in right at the outset of the New 52. There wasn't even a ramp up to
the
the
Detective Comics were like Joker
Hey,
lost
there's
his
my
face.
Aquaman.
Like,
Yeah.
that was a good Aquaman run.
that
really
run
good.
was very much like, we're not going to worry about this stuff being kid friendly.
I mean, the Batman, people like to laud the Batman and Robin run, but introducing Damian Wayne really ups the ante of that as well,
It
because
does.
he's a violent, like, a character that traditionally dampens that in that world.
was
It's
such
like,
a-
surprise, I'm killing
But
everyone.
he's one of those things where, like, they had introduced him shortly before, and they kept him around because they were
Yeah.
like, he's too good a
And
character.
it
No,
worked,
he's
and
not.
I liked his. I think his original Batman run is amazing. I think it worked very well. I will argue that one, but. But they figured out that they could fix some of their problems instead of kind of giving up on Grimdark. They could fix some of their Grimdark. I call it Grimdark, which is the aura that
Justice League Dark comes out
the
at
thing.
this time as well.
Yeah. Well, it
Because
was.
they got the Vertigo characters back in the fold, which was another thing they actually story-wise came out of the New 52.
It's a notion in comic book that some comic book writers of a certain generation held that one of the reasons that they were not taken seriously was because that serious people dealt with serious issues, except that, of course, they didn't really understand what serious issues were, and they weren't the kind of writers that were writing comic books. They fought mad scientists and evil aliens, so their notion of what a serious idea was a little juvenile. And so an attempt to be mature in a juvenile way is almost always going to inevitably fall on its face. And they figured out how to make Superman's grimdark work with Superman simply by going back and starting Superman over from a place of significantly less innocence. And if we just say
this was
Superman,
Grant Morrison, who we're usually slavishly praising.
yeah, and he did what he was paid to do, and bless him, is if we can make Superman cold and alien and distant and judgmental, then it's okay for him to be this kind of in this grimdark universe, because he's not Superman anymore. We can make this Superman that's a little creepy.
I would encourage people to
Your
go to the
mileage
New
will
52
vary.
and
Mileage
look
will
at
vary.
the Greg Pak and Aaron Cooter Action Comics
Yeah.
version of Superman, because that is, I think, more of what people were hoping to come out of it and less of maybe what we actually got. And that is most of what I think that version is what has fed the Rebirth Superman. That is, Superman's better now than
So
it's
yeah,
been
how do you
in
get
forever.
to
and
summer
ever.
2016?
Summer 2016. Who was it? Who finally? They're like, okay, we got to knock this off. Like, finally, someone said we have to.
I assume
Jeff
it was
Johns?
Jeff Johns,
Jeff
but we have
Johns.
no idea.
One of the Trinity.
Somebody said it's time to embrace what made us popular in the first place, which was not Watchmen. Like, in fact, Watchmen has officially become the villain in a weird way of the DC
Spoilers,
comics.
sort of, but not really.
Spoilers,
Not
sort
really.
of. Not really. So their whole notion is that they've kind of in a meta text of storytelling said, we're really sorry.
We're just going
Yeah.
to very quickly set this up. All those books that they restarted in 2011, including books that had been numbered in the 8 and 900s,
Action,
like
Detective.
Action and Detective, they're two long-running ones. Everyone had gone back to number ones because they were like simplicity overall, which had its merits.
Worked and didn't.
But those books
As
were
with all
coming
things.
along, and it had been a few years, and they were starting to hit issue 52. And we didn't really get into it here, but like
No.
over time, 52 became sort of a magic number at DC because you like to recur to themes and things you've used before. And so I assume, I don't know exactly at what point they decided this was going to happen, but they were sort of like, that's it. That's around a good time to like start new number ones, but not necessarily put the story back to scratch or half fake scratch the way they had done in 2011. They were like, we will give people new starting points, but to orient them to these new starting points, we're going to do a comic, and this was a standalone comic, an 80-page long
80.
story, an 80-page special.
Huge.
Called DC Rebirth number 1.
That's how you justify putting a $5.99 price tag on something. You
They
give,
Yeah.
give me 80 pages.
Yeah.
Written by like one of their
There we are.
best
Right, by
writers.
Jeff, yeah.
With
exactly.
beautiful
Hilariously,
art.
it was $2.99 and then it was $5.99, and now you can buy a hardcover for $17.99. It's confusing. But you're looking for this comic. DC Universe Rebirth is a special where essentially what they said was, look, we're not throwing out the last 5 years.
No, which they shouldn't.
But we're also going to look back at some of the stuff that came before and try to let it back in and find a story reason for that to happen. Now, if you've been listening to the rest of this show, you know that we'll have to meet again in 5 years and be like, how long did it work and what were the problems? But now,
it's been a mixed bag.
working.
It's working. For the first time in years, it's working. And I feel like
There's been good stuff at every point.
Yes.
But
Always.
I gotta say, there's a lot of excitement.
It feels to me like with Rebirth, it was like finally there was like sunlight parting the clouds, and it was like, oh, that's DC.
And you can talk about the actual tonal content of that special read almost like really meta, like almost as an apology.
It's very much. It was a real. It was like I used to have a list of like the five aspects of an apology because I'm really irritated by people who
You had a
fake
list
apologies.
of aspects of an apology?
I was like, if you're going to apologize for something, here are the things. Here's like the 5 things you have to do to make it a real apology. Otherwise, you're just being a jerk.
There's also, if you watched the WonderCon presentation last year, I think of the sort of the trident head of DC, they all came out there and they said
Jeff Johns,
Dan DiDio, and
Jim Lee are the 3 sort of heads of DC.
They all said that they understand where people were coming from, where the concerns were coming. Like it was very well put out there that it was done for the readers and for the fans, and the result feels genuine, which is really nice.
Yes, it does. It is a genuine. It is a genuine apology of a book.
The part in the book where I realized, oh, they're going back, they're figuring this out, like, was where it's at the end. It could be a spoiler. I apologize. Turn your ears off if you don't want to hear it. But it's the part where it's been Wally West, right, who's been like trying to get
So
Barry
Wally
Allen's
West had been
attention
kind
the
of
entire
mostly
Wally
missing
West.
from the universe. The 90s Wally West, the one that people know, like, I mean, he's the Wally West from decades. Anyway, the one who was Flash in the 90s is what I mean.
They yanked him from the universe.
He had not been around. It was one of those characters who hadn't really made the jump to New 52. A new version of him had shown up eventually once he got introduced in Flash. Anyway, a different version of him had shown up, but a lot of people sort of missed that traditional one. And he had shown up in a side story when DC was sort of flirting with bringing this continuity back. They brought. Was he in Titans Hunt or did they just refer to
He's
him?
in Titans Hunt, yeah.
There was a side book where this had happened.
So
but
good.
His formal sort of re-entry into the universe is the through line of the DC Rebirth special.
So,
and
like,
people cried.
Yeah, like even as a person who's not like beholden to DC, like I still recognize their place in literature and in comics and everything and like everything else, and I'm trying to get better at it. But even as that, like mostly an outsider looking in, I got to that page and almost cried because it really felt like, so the page, here's what happens. Wally West has been trying to get everyone who's ever loved him their attention. He's stuck in the Speed Force, cannot break through.
The Speed Force is what they use to run fast, but it also ends up being a place you can get trapped in.
Yeah, it's kind of like another dimension, ish. And he finally gets through to Barry Allen. Barry Allen doesn't remember him, but then towards the very, very end, he finally gets it, and he reaches out and pulls him in, and he says, Wally, how could I forget you? And that, even now I'm getting chills saying it, I did not read that as Barry Allen saying that to Wally West.
It was DC.
I read that as DC going, we're so sorry, we lost track.
We threw the baby out with the bathwater.
How could we forget this legacy? Like it wasn't even Wally West. Wally West was
Just the
indicative
representation,
of this legacy of like gold, bright, sun, shiny, optimistic, and like just like legacy characters and all that other stuff.
books-
They were trying to layer on so much grimdark.
books that you can give to an 11-year-old kid, which is hard. Which are
still mixed bag.
They're
It's
mixed
an
bag,
evolving
but,
You don't have to be able to
question.
give every
No.
comic
It'd be nice
to
if
an
there were
11-year-old.
some,
But
and
it'd
they're
be
moving
nice.
in that
Yeah.
direction.
It'd be nice if there was a Flash book I could give to an 11-year-old.
Yeah,
Which,
but
like,
it felt like there was very much like this sort of like this maxim at DC is like it's got to be grimdark, and it's like no, it doesn't. You can have that, and there's a place for that, but some of these characters are
That's-
very bright and optimistic.
that's-
Like Superman's made to shine in the sun.
That's
to that.
That's actually a point I want. This was one of the things that like one of my because there are a bunch of 52 books I really did love, but one of the things that drove me a little nuts about 52. Or about the new 52. New 52.
There's a
was
story
a great
called
weekly
52.
series.
It was a weekly series.
Different book.
Was
very
that
good.
everything was starting to look and sound the same. I felt like there was so much, there was like editorial control from up high that like it was hard to tell one book from the other often unless it was so far off on the fringes like Gotham Academy,
I love Gotham
which was
Academy.
great.
This was sort of about
good.
a year before Rebirth. They had started greenlighting some of these sort of offbeat
The
things that were
DCUYOU.
Yeah, I liked
It's
it.
a different thing. Like they weren't the smash hit that everyone was kind of hoping, but they're going to have long-term effects in terms of broadening the tone.
And the thing that they're starting to figure out is, and like even like Lego Batman kind of touched on this, is like one of the things that makes Batman fun is that he's fun. Mm-hmm. And Batman in movies has never really been fun before, not in a long.
That's one of the reasons I love Lego Batman so much. Is it was like, this is actually kind of a Batman movie.
But you have to think about people responded so strongly to the Nolan trilogy, and I mean,
did.
it won Oscars.
I was one of those people.
It's great. I
So,
love it.
so
Great.
again, if you're looking at the person who's sitting at the top with the millions of dollars, that's what you want more of.
Oh, I know. But now they're starting to figure out that not every that we don't need a grim dark reboot of
Well, and there's a quote they actually
everything.
because I finally sat down with Identity Crisis specifically for this show because I've been hearing about it for years. And so it was a very interesting reading experience, especially knowing a lot of what was going into it. But there was an interesting, there's a monogram in it where Brad Meltzer includes the quote, I think it's some variation on, an era can be said to have ended when its basic illusions have been exhausted. And what's interesting about that is that sort of gives the game away. That if you're going to start if you're gonna start letting tons of murder and sexual assault into your superhero books and have them make these really morally weird choices about it, like maybe you're putting a cap on things, because where do you go from that? How do you do 10 more years of stories from that without everything just becoming sort of like it's a very interesting question that a genie they've let out of the bottle and back in over and over again. But we're currently in a swing where we're like, maybe we try to establish something different.
Well, it's true, and that's what I love about Elseworlds is that we can play with those ideas and let the genie out of the bottle in contained spaces. But like it's okay, and there's an argument for it's just another story, but there's also an argument for not every character has to tell every story, and there is such a thing as a good Superman story and a bad Superman story, or a story that isn't a Superman story. There are stories that aren't Superman stories, and I think that's okay. Mm-hmm. I don't think we need Superman in every story. I just think we need good Superman stories. So we're starting to.
Sorry.
No, we're doing good. I'm going to say a couple things, and then we're going to recommend some DC books for you guys. I want to mention again Dan Smith, who did our art back here. He also, Dan Smith, bless him, has a board game called Battle of the Bands card game. It's a card game. That we might be playing around. He brought us a copy because he's wonderful. You can find it at Battle of the Bands, the Battle of the Bands Facebook page. I'm going to give it a roll and let you know what I think later. I'm excited.
Those look awesome.
I know, they're really fun. And he's got a special comic book for it as well.
Nice.
I'll also say we're going to probably, you guys can recommend some subjects for next week. So I think what we're going to do, we're going to
we don't know what to talk about next week, so you guys tell us what you want to hear.
I mean, I got options. I'm not going to say we have options. We all have options. Kids got to have options.
So wait, are we drawing suggestions from you all and having...
Yeah, so in the chat, tell us what you want us to talk about, and we'll give it a look.
Or tweet. If
Or
you have
tweet
an
at us.
idea.
Tweet at us.
We'll probably figure it out by Friday. So
what will we do? Are you
Hale
going to run an
Archer
online
says
poll
Punisher.
on your Twitter?
I'm not going to do a poll. I'm just going to look at what I like and see what.
Oh,
counts.
okay.
We're not mad. We're not letting you fly the plane. We're just letting you touch the controls. And
Fickle Fandom says, do the How to Read a Comic Book episode.
Tempted. I may want to do
Your
a little more
homework is
work.
Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics, and we'll get something together.
I've only not done it because it's intimidating.
It's so good.
There are so
and
many.
if you are curious about that, by the way, you should be checking out the show Crafting Comics, which Jim Higgins is doing right now over on Alpha with Tiffany Smith. And they're actually doing like a comic book course he teaches comics, so they've kind of taken that
Tiffany
material.
Smith?
Yeah.
Oh, I
Also-
hate her.
I know. Also, Hector Navarro tonight, just we were told, is talking about Old Man Logan with Mark Miller at 6:30 on the Alpha Book Club.
Mark Miller is
6:30
diving
PM
into
tonight.
Alpha Book Club.
So that's the thing that's happening as well.
From the other side of the world.
All right,
That's
so
true.
we have a
Just trying to distract himself.
we have
from
a few
politics,
suggestions.
Oh, we'll do suggestions later. We'll do suggestions off the
But
air.
they have some for us,
Oh.
right?
Oh,
Yeah,
do you want a
no, these are
collection?
I thought we could just
right now.
Yeah,
No,
no.
I mean or we only have a few minutes. We could recommend some books.
go for it.
Yeah, we'll debate because that way we we can be like, oh
'Kay.
god, do we have to do that one?
Okay, sounds good. Go.
I'm gonna recommend like these are some deep cuts. If you're up for something crazy,
That's a great series.
the Grant Morrison Seven Soldiers of Victory is really interesting.
Demon
It's
Knights.
it's 7
Knights was
superheroes
Yeah.
pulled together by fate to stop this terrible thing from happening. There's like one book at the beginning and one book at the end where they're all kind of involved. Otherwise, they're all on their own 4-issue miniseries that interconnect, but they don't ever really meet. They're almost like a mousetrap puzzle of fate finding a way to interconnectively destroy this evil, and it's all over the place. I love it. And yeah.
I'm going to recommend the 3 things from the Trinity that I always recommend. Read Batman Long Halloween, and then read everything else that Jeff Loeb and Tim Sale have written about Batman. For Wonder Woman, read Grant Morrison's Year 1. And for Superman, read All-Star Superman. If you don't cry in issue 6, you're not a human.
That's very fair.
All-Star Superman is the book that you hand to people who don't think they like Superman.
Yes.
And the people who do like Superman. It's amazing. It does both.
Yep.
Yeah, those are fantastic recommendations. If you want to check out Rebirth, Wonder Woman has been one of the standouts. Detective Comics has been going over really, really well. I don't know if anyone
Action
else wants to
Comics.
throw-
Action Comics.
Yes.
Yeah,
People
yeah.
are so into Superman right now, and it's really fun.
Super Sons, too. Like, I didn't know Jonathan Kent was what I needed to care about
Superman,
Superboy,
no,
and then here he
Superman
is.
has a son, and it's great. It's needed this for ages.
Yeah.
I love it.
It's a really interesting time because I love it's precisely the kind of thing that will have long-term consequences that they'll have to fix later, but it's so much fun
cares?
right now. Just make the stories great.
I read a lot of Rebirth over the weekend. I am a giant fan of Flash.
Yeah, and you read a book too. Also, you touched
Super
the book,
Gods?
Super Gods.
Oh, I had already read that.
Oh,
I read that last year, Taliesin.
Yeah.
No, but actually, read Super Gods. It's a fantastic explanation of kind of the history, not even the history of comics, just the social history behind where the comics came from, by Grant Morrison. It's great. So that's my right. Go read that.
If you
Educate
want
yourself.
Silver Age, they've been doing beautiful new collections of that stuff.
Yes.
But if you want to do it the way I did, the volumes, we said Crisis on Infinite Earths, they collect the precursors, the annual ones, as Crisis on Multiple Earths.
Yeah.
It's several volumes, and it's that sort of annual check-in with the DC universe that I loved so much.
I'd say Kirby, but we'll get there later. That's a whole show.
Oh, there's more. We didn't even get to some of that stuff. But classic runs like George Purse's Wonder Woman,
Oh,
and then
very
Greg
good.
Rucka did a
Yes.
previous run. He's currently
They're
on the book.
they're reprinting
and
it right now.
reprinting his older run, which I highly recommend. Also, Gail Simone.
Let's start over with Matt. Where can we find you online, and do you want to plug anything?
You can find me on Twitter at the Matt Key. I do I'll be on Screen Junkies tomorrow and Friday on their news channel, helping them out with that stuff. So maybe you'll catch me there. And then I do a weekly Marvel show called Marvel Movie News over on Popcorn Talk Network. So you can see that's on Tuesdays at 2:30 Pacific, and that's live.
I'm Amy Dallen. You see me here a lot. I'm very excited because we do a Doctor Who game on Fridays, and a certain Taliesin Jaffe has just joined us for hopefully as long as we can convince him to
Oh, I'm
stay,
in.
and he's fantastic. So we're having a lot of fun over there. Thank you so much for being here,
Thanks.
Ashley.
Oh my God!
Letting me
There's been a few people saying, who's your guest? Tell us about your guest.
Well, I'm Ashley Victoria Robinson. You can find me all over the internet at Ashley V. Robinson. Go to youtube.com/Jawin, Jawin. I co-host a lot of different stuff there with the DC Comics co-host Jason Inman, who's also my husband. We just did a Spider-Man trailer reaction, and our Flash review is going up, so go check that out. And then every week, the Geek History Lesson podcast, geekhistorylesson.com.
If your brain was melting, this is what you need.
This is-
Yeah,
This is
we'll
good
teach you
stuff.
the entire history of a character in about an hour, and this week it's on something that I forget because we record them
Good plug.
before. But yeah, there's 160 episodes, so go find one you want to listen to.
Yep.
And please, I was making sure you had enough time for your plug.
Yeah, I'm just.
Oh no, it's on Red Hood this week.
Yes,
there you
yeah.
go, Jason Todd.
It's like I saw this.
I know.
Everyone
just
loves
went
a Red
live
Hood.
yesterday.
My name is Taliesin Jaffe. You can find me at Executive Goth on Twitter and Instagram, mostly Twitter these days. You can see me Thursday nights on Critical Role, where I played D&D with a bunch of nerdy-ass voice actors, and for a limited time on Fridays at Eric's TBD RPG, where I'm playing Professor Chronotis. It's a lot of fun. Also, you can see a couple of us this weekend at WonderCon.
Yes.
We have Saturday
We'll
panels.
all be there.
We just don't all have panels.
We don't all have
I
panels.
have a panel. You have a
That
panel.
will be easier to spot because he's 7 feet tall.
Yeah, well, I'm almost 7 feet tall.
And we'll announce next week's pretty soon. And this is just me signing off, telling you, and hopefully we'll sign off that despite what the internet tells you, it's what you like that makes you interesting, not talking about what you don't. Stay cool, kids.
Boom.